offerings within the Industrial Truck Association can provide to the end user market in terms of consulting and support to improve in the safety culture. So wanted to talk about really where we've come from. If you look pre-pandemic, a few years ago, as we were in pre-pandemic times looking at a very tight labor market, and we were looking for an employee base. We're struggling with retention, looking for individuals to come into our manufacturing operations, our warehousing operations, and competing with one another for that. And now going through the pandemic and experiencing a different labor market, and now coming out the backside of that, seeing yet again an even tighter labor market and unique environment. And the significant portion of this has to do with turnover that we're seeing, turnover and retention issues. And with that, we see significant numbers of new people entering the workplace on a consistent basis. And with that is the importance of training that goes along with dealing with a significant number of new employees coming in. And as we now see these employees with may not have experience in distribution environments, in production environments, training them up in the right way becomes a very critical aspect. And as our businesses struggle with things like significant amounts of inventory coming to them, capacity issues within our supply chain, shortages in terms of workers at the port, and stoppages and backups at ports, we end up seeing that inventory can overwhelm our environments. Variability becomes a norm in both the manufacturing and distribution environment. And with that amount of variability, we see challenges around standard work. And things become, again, with variability and lack of consistency, the need to keep people informed and trained becomes very important as we go towards building a strong safety culture. And executing on the basics becomes very important. And we can talk about very advanced things and about technology, which we'll go through today, but operator training is a very basic element, and not all companies are keeping up with the simple basics of forklift operator training. In the Industrial Truck Association, its members with its dealer communities and manufacturers provide the capability to get out and train companies and provide those services on an ongoing basis. And so we encourage you to reach out to the dealer networks within the Industrial Truck Association to leverage on this operator training, again, supporting these basics. Pedestrian awareness, so it's not just about driving a forklift and maintaining forklift safety within an operation, it's also the pedestrians that are throughout those operations. And as we experience this variability that I spoke about related to potentially overwhelming inventories, or new employees consistently coming into the operation, staying up with pedestrian awareness is also just as critical as keeping up with making sure that we have trained forklift operators in our facilities. With that is
this one? Check, check, check. Check, 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 check. Check, check, check. Hello, check, 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 check. Hello, check. Check, check.
standing order?
Global NCAP is performing today a new car-to-car crash test. In this opportunity, we have on one side the cheapest sedan from Hyundai sold in the US market, which is
Hello, hello, hello.
there's no room for another chair. And you, after you introduce the speaker, you can sit on this chair after the first one. Okay, good morning, everyone. Is this mic on? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I can see a few more people coming in, so we will be getting started in just a few minutes. And I think do we have all of our speakers? Oh no, there's one. Okay, so we might just wait for people to take a seat. Please don't be afraid to come and sit down the front, it's fine. Now, I'm advised that we are going live to YouTube. I'm not sure if that's actually happened already yet, but if it hasn't, it would be good if someone tells us. We are good? Okay, great. So welcome everybody to the National Press Club, or virtually, to the Roundtable for a Roadmap for Safer Vehicles 2030, a Global Perspective. Today we are joined by a host of excellent and experienced speakers in road safety for a roundtable that will provide an overview of vehicle safety and the challenges and opportunities in the UN Decade of Action for Road Safety 2021 to 2030, which is being held ahead of the UN high-level meetings which are taking place later this week in New York. We're going to be profiling the worldwide role of new car assessment programs and similar consumer rating systems to advance vehicle safety. And we'll be highlighting the vehicle safety recommendations of the global plan for the decade and their potential to contribute to the target to halve road deaths and serious injuries by 2030. So I'd like to welcome everyone who's been able to join us in person here today, and also welcome everyone who's joining us online. I would also like to introduce our speakers. Now we have joining us today Stephen Cliff, Administrator for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Welcome, Stephen. We're not sitting in correct order, so don't be confused. Please put your hand up when I call your name. David Ward, Executive President of Towards Zero Foundation and Global NCAP. Stephen Brodziak, Chair of Latin NCAP. Matthew Avery, Member of the Board of Euro NCAP, and also from Thatcham Research. David Harkey, President of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And also we were to be joined by Jennifer Homendi, who is the Chair of the US National Transportation Safety Board. Unfortunately, Jennifer has been called away, and we will be very pleased to have Kelly Hesler speaking on her behalf. So that's our fantastic group of speakers. Before we move into our speaker presentations, I did just want to make a couple of mentions. My name's Carla Horveg. I'm the CEO of Australasian NCAP, which is Australia and New Zealand. Just some very small remarks, and I will keep it brief because we do have a lot of speakers and a lot of interesting content to get through today. But ANCAP, as we call it, ANCAP for others, has been going for 30 years. It was the second NCAP to start after NHTSA. And we've seen over those 30 years a really strong and interesting industry shift, and I think this is probably a good context to paint for the presentations and the conversations that we'll have today. In our experience, we've seen these distinct phases starting with strong resistance initially, moving through to acceptance of an NCAP program and use, and now we're sitting in a position of influence. So achieving a 5-star safety rating in Australia and New Zealand is seen as a competitive advantage for manufacturers offering vehicles into those markets. That has taken many, many years and many blood, sweat and tears from many other people before I started to get us to that position. But it is now seen as a platform where there's an opportunity to up the ante, and manufacturers are competing, and we are seeing now more manufacturers coming into the Australian and New Zealand market that have not been there before, and they are very keen to achieve 5-star safety ratings, and that keeps the pressure on those that have been operating in the market for a long time. So that role of vehicle safety in the safe system is very strong in our market, and I think that's an important point to note, that it is a changing thing over time, the influence and the way the market responds, and understanding where each of the jurisdictions are in that journey, I think, is really important context for today's conversation. Having said that, the success of NCAP is also a challenge, because we now are in a position where most consumers think and expect that cars are safe. And that means that they don't necessarily seek out a 5-star safety rating because they just assume that all cars have them. So that is where we're shifting our focus now, is to ensure that we're able to keep the pressure on and to keep consumers interested and engaged and understanding what they need to be looking for in their vehicles, and to keep that pressure on manufacturers to deliver safest vehicles as possible into our market. I'm going to leave it there because I know that everyone is dying to get up here, and we do have some people who've travelled who may be suffering from jet lag, so I do want to keep the momentum going, and I would like to ask Stephen to come and join us as our first speaker. So Stephen Cliff, as I mentioned, is the Administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA as we call it for short. And Stephen will be talking about the proposed upgrade of US NCAP and request for comments process. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, thanks so much, Carla. Really appreciate that. And it's great to meet you in person today. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's really fantastic to be here. I appreciate that introduction. What a great venue, a really neat place to have a meeting. So I appreciate having the opportunity to speak here. And on behalf of NHTSA, congratulations on the Australasian NCAP's 30th anniversary. I was very happy to provide a video message for that. Hopefully that was well received. It's always a little challenging to look into a camera and pretend like it's an audience, but nevertheless, I really enjoyed doing that and appreciate the opportunity. Your work, as you mentioned, ensures safer vehicles for Australians and New Zealanders, and it provides them those resources that they need to seek out safer cars for their family, and that information is really critical. It's the heart of what NCAP programs are all about. And then you've also really supported others, and you see that in your leadership here today. You've supported programs in Southeast Asia and Latin America, and I think that's really a true example of the spirit of collaboration and cooperation of the global NCAP. NHTSA and US DOT have a long history of cooperation and collaboration with the UN and the World Health Organization to address traffic safety issues. As we continue that important relationship, we're proud to work with the UN to address impaired driving, driver education, automated driving systems, and general vehicle safety regulations through the Working Party 1 and Working Party 29 process. We believe this spirit of cooperation is essential as we can share best practices, research, and data. No country is an island in the fight to save lives on our roads, and we can and should work together. So I'm very pleased to be here today as NHTSA's recently confirmed administrator. I've been in the job since last year, so for about 18 months, but I'm very pleased to be drawing on years of experience in public service and developing regulations at the state level as well now at the national level, to be the 16th administrator of NHTSA. If you If you went to my office right now, you would see Sweet 16 things all over the office that people thought was pretty funny to put around. It's good. I'm very honored to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate in this position and for the President's trust in me to lead this team. We're improving roadway safety, fostering innovation, advancing transportation equity, and addressing climate change all at the same time. It's a really fantastic and frankly, kind of an easy mission because we have so much to do, but the staff is very mission driven. So leading an organization like this is really quite an honor. Under the leadership of Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, our work at NHTSA focuses on making vehicles and roads safer for everyone. It's the foundation of everything we do. It's literally our middle name. We're committed to improving safety for all road users, not just drivers and passengers, but pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, older Americans, and people with disabilities. Our work is urgent because of what we see on our nation's roadways. Tens of thousands of traffic fatalities make up about 95% of all transportation-related deaths in this country. And when we speak of traffic fatalities, we have to remember that these are people, not just statistics. There are family members, friends, colleagues, and neighbors. Every life is precious. That's why we've got to change the culture that accepts the loss of tens of thousands of people in traffic crashes as inevitable. And the increases in traffic fatalities that we've seen since 2020 cannot be the new normal. Changing that culture and saving lives will require a transformational and collaborative approach to safety. We were just having a brief conversation before the start here about the safe system approach. It's a really critical thing because it puts people first, where the system serves the needs of the users, not the other way around. NHTSA and USDOT have adopted the safe system approach, as are state and local governments across the U.S. The safe system approach incorporates the 5 E's. That's equity, engineering, education, enforcement, and emergency medical services. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at the recently released National Roadway Safety Strategy that DOT put out earlier this year. The report offers more on implementing the safe system approach, and it identifies action items for everyone working to save lives on the road. We're committed to working with our international partners, governments, NGOs, industry, and other stakeholders to achieve that very important UN objective of reducing fatalities 50% by 2030. And we can all work to make our transportation system safe for all users. So on to NCAP. The new car assessment program, it's an important component of improving the crashworthiness and safety of new cars, trucks, and SUVs. We launched this originally in 1978 with frontal barrier crash tests, and then for cars, and then in 1983 we began testing light trucks. Since its formation, it's provided families with unbiased information on the safety of vehicles. It's also leveraged market forces to encourage manufacturers to design higher levels of safety into their vehicles. The NCAP 5-star safety ratings appear regularly in television and print ads for new vehicles, and no manufacturer wants to receive a low star rating. The NCAP program that NHTSA pioneered is now replicated around the world, ensuring that consumers have ready access to information about vehicle safety. That information is especially critical when we see the number of 0 and 1-star NCAP ratings in crash tests in emerging programs. Families in the market for a new or used car deserve better. They deserve to have the information about the relative safety of those vehicles. And we hope that those low ratings, especially the 0 and 1-star ratings, will spur manufacturers to recall and improve. So, our program is getting a major upgrade. We're embarking on a badly needed modernization of NCAP. It will account for new technologies, improve consumer education, and plan for the program's future. In March, we published our request for comment on our proposal. We proposed adding 4 additional driver assistance systems, advanced driver assistance systems, or ADAS technologies. That's lane keeping support, pedestrian automatic emergency braking, blind spot warning, and blind spot intervention. And sometimes we're asked, why does it take so long for a new rule for us to issue a new rule or a regulation or a program like NCAP. We're required to base all of our decisions on sound science, data, and research. So before a technology can be considered for inclusion in NCAP, it has to meet all 4 of our established criteria. And those are, does the update address a safety need? Do designs exist for the update? Does the update have the potential to save lives? And finally, do we have a test procedure to assess its performance objectively? When combined, the 8S technologies that I just mentioned answer the mail there. They address a significant portion of all crashes and fatalities and injuries. Adding them to our 5-star safety rating can spur this installation across the vehicle fleet, regardless of price point. Some safety features today are only available in the highest price models, the highest trim levels, or in the most expensive vehicles. And families shouldn't be priced out of safety. NCAP provides incentives to automakers to strengthen their vehicles' safety features and performance, and including those features in tests will do the same. Future NCAP plans will include ways to measure the safety of vehicles for pedestrians and others outside the vehicle, as well as other improvements. We proposed more stringent test criteria for the existing technologies currently in NCAP, as well as a plan to develop a future rating system for all crash avoidance safety technologies. We recognize that consumer education is important, and NCAP is a trustworthy source of information on vehicle safety for families shopping for new vehicles. Our proposal includes plans to educate consumers about safety technologies that could help people drive safer and address risky behaviors behind the wheel. And it includes the first ever roadmap for NCAP, with our plans to update the program in phases over the next several years. The comment period recently closed. We received more than 4,000 comments on our proposal from automakers, safety advocates, organizations, and the public. So we'll be thoroughly evaluating and considering all of those comments as we go ahead and finalize this new NCAP program. And then we're working on several additional rulemakings in addition to NCAP that will be of interest to this audience as well. That includes separate rulemakings requiring automatic emergency braking in passenger vehicles, and that will include pedestrian automatic emergency braking for the first time. It also automatic emergency braking in medium-duty and heavy-duty trucks. So a lot of work going on related to safety and a lot of new rulemakings happening in NHTSA now. So as I said earlier, just to wrap up, we have to change a culture that accepts all of these crashes as inevitable. We can't let this rise in fatalities become the new normal. We're committed to advancing the safety of vehicles on America's roads by working with other countries to reach that very important 50% reduction goal in 2030. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to give you a brief update on our program, and of course, to learn and hear from all of you as well. It's also a fantastic opportunity to meet many of you in person with whom I've had interactions on screen, but this is the new normal, so we're working through that hybrid process, but it's fantastic. And Carla, just thank you again, really appreciate it, and thank you to all of you as well.
Thank you very much to Stephen, and I know that we'll be watching very closely those changes as they come through, as the process continues. We'll be watching from Australia, and Stephen, I know that you do have to run to other commitments, so thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to now invite David Ward to come up. David has assured me he'll be on his best behaviour. But I know he does have something quite exciting in store. So, David, please come and join us.
Great. Well, thanks. Thanks very much, Carla. And it's a great privilege for me to follow Stephen Cliff. I've worked closely with NHTSA administrators all the way back to Ricardo Martinez, and of course Joan Claybrook, actually, although not when she was NHTSA administrator. So it's great to renew the acquaintance, and I can't help observing. I can do this as a sort of. My wife actually is from the US, So I suppose I have a half a stake, but it was noticeable that in a recent administration, there never was a NHTSA administrator, which I think told you something about the priorities at the time. But anyway, enough of that before I really get into trouble. I just want to follow on from what's been said here, which is the unique contribution that NCAPs have made. And really there is a clear success formula for vehicle safety that we've seen over the last 30 to 40 years. And certainly we all stand in awe of the mother of NCAPs, pictured there, Joan Claybrook, who initiated this kind of project way back in 1978. And it's very nice also to celebrate Australasian NCAP being the first. The little map, sorry, the next follow-on NCAP, the map shows the different NCAPs around the world. And I think it's really important to understand this combined effect, the regulatory push and the demand pull, with NCAPs working on the demand pull side of the equation, and how effective they've been all around the world. This is a model that works everywhere. Next slide, not happening. There we go. What Global NCAP, which has actually just celebrated its 10th anniversary, has been doing over those 10 years, particularly has been supporting emerging NCAPs, particularly Latin NCAP, ASEAN NCAP in Southeast Asia, and also then trying to start up programs in India and more recently in Africa. And I'd just like to briefly dwell on our experience in India, which started in 2014. So it's probably a little difficult to see there, but we've just this year crossed the threshold of having tested over 50 vehicles in our Safer Cars for India program. And you can see from the line of blue stars down at the bottom, which was at the beginning of the program, everything was 0. And now we have 5-star results with manufacturers, and I'm very pleased to say Indian manufacturers like Mahindra and Tata competing for the very best results in our program. The little graph there also shows the incredible drop there's been on 0-star cars. And we've also been working very well with the Indian government, with the Minister for Highways and Transport, Nitin Gadkari, and they have also supported the work that we've been doing by introducing much stronger, more stringent vehicle safety standards. They apply front and side impact, they apply pedestrian protection and many others. And really the latest very hot news just from last week is that Minister Gadkari announced that they're going to establish a permanent NCAP program in India now, a so-called Bharat NCAP from April next year. That's always been the ambition of our project, that it would turn into a permanent Indian program. And we're thrilled that that is now happening. And that our understanding is it will start from the test protocol that we are now applying in India. So we're very proud to have contributed to that process and delighted that India is going to join the family of permanent NCAPs very soon. Something I just want to highlight a bit is why and how NCAPs work. And this diagram tries to capture what I think is an accurate way of reading what NCAPs do, and particularly how innovation happens in the regulatory system. You know, there's a naive and I think very simplistic view of innovation, which is that it's a linear process, that you have a combination of brilliant minds and entrepreneurs working more or less in isolation who come up with a technology or come up with an idea and then they bring it to market. And also part of the message behind this, this linear approach, is that they're best left alone. Don't bother them with regulation or anything else, just leave them to it. Actually, this is a myth. It simply isn't the way that the automotive innovation system works. It is actually a circular process with lots of complex feedback loops and interaction, and it is driven by public policy. Public policy demands for safer vehicles, for cleaner vehicles that are carbon neutral and so on. That is the public policy push. That creates the incentive for innovation for the entrepreneurs and the boffins to come up with the great ideas. And that then produces the prototypes which lead to deployment and entry into the market. And the critical thing that NCAPs do is they can accelerate that entry into the market and penetration through a market. And what often happens, and we've seen this so often, is that left to itself, the market may stall on certain technologies, particularly in emerging markets. And so what NCAPs can do, combined with regulation, is overcome those hurdles. They can make sure that, for example, a technology like electronic stability control, which started out as a luxury feature in high-end vehicles, gets pushed through into the whole vehicle class. And that, as I say, is a combination of a regulatory requirement, but very often before that, an NCAP drawing attention to a technology, highlighting its success and building consumer demand. And so I think it's very important to see what we all do as integral to the innovation process. It's a circle, not a straight line. I just want to also highlight the success that there's been, particularly in the last decade. There was the first UN decade of action. And to give you, this is an absolutely key example, is progress on the standard United Nations front and side impact crash tests, which now apply to over 90% of the new car market. There are very, very few vehicles now that do not pass these minimum regulations. I should point out the front impact test is usually done at 56 kilometers an hour, so it's not as tough as an NCAP test. But nevertheless, to see that progress, particularly over the last decade, has been very satisfying. And for sure, the NCAP work in emerging markets has been very critical. Another example of success is the fitment rate of electronic stability control. This rather complicated graph shows, basically, don't worry too much about what all the lines, they're all going up. And the ultimate story there, this is for passenger vehicles, is that the fitment rate over the last decade has doubled to 80%. Still not quite at 100%. And down below the yellow and white illustration there shows how very often it was NCAPs putting ESC into their rating systems ahead of regulation that accelerated the progress. So I'd say those two things are the standout of the last decade in vehicle safety. Front and side impact and electronic stability control, which I could say easily has been the life-saving technology of the last decade. And we now want to see close to 100% and also spread it through other vehicle classes. But the challenge we face is pretty significant. This graph is some just fairly straightforward forecasting that Towards Zero Foundation Global NCAP has done. The gray bars represent vehicle production levels up to COVID. The first dip there is the financial crisis. And you'll see we reach a peak around 2017 of production. In the first just under 2 decades, the annual growth rate of vehicles was 2.4%, annualized growth rate. Now, obviously, there's been a big shock due to COVID, but all the signs are that the growth rate is probably going to return to trend unless something very different happens. And the red bars represent what would happen if we do that in terms of vehicle numbers. Blue is just a hypothetical stagnation level, and green, which some might say is the desirable one, is a reduced car dependency path. But what's impressive is just the sheer numbers, that the red bars by 2030, if that's what happens, mean we're going to have over 1.1 billion new motor vehicles joining the vehicle fleet. By the way, this does not include motorcycles. Even on the green bar, it's somewhere around 700,000 new vehicles. So the reality is the decade we're now facing, there is a huge cohort of new vehicles entering the market. And for me, absolutely obvious is that all of those vehicles need to be the cleanest and the safest they've ever been in history. That's what we need to make sure happens. And most of this new production is going to happen in emerging markets. In high-income countries, it's simply replacing the existing fleet, whereas in emerging markets, it's expanding hugely the new level of vehicles. We will, as a global fleet, easily in this decade exceed 2 billion vehicles in use. I stress that's not including motorcycles, which is another whole, motorcycles more or less another billion. So we are still facing an extraordinary human experiment in levels of motorization, and that's going to be a big challenge for us. I can't get this. I've got a minor challenge, which I can't get the slides to change. Oh, there we go. Well, the framework for this, in terms of safety anyway, is the new UN Decade of Action. That was proposed at the 3rd Global Ministerial Conference in Sweden in February 20, endorsed by the UN General Assembly, and the particular thing with a target to halve road deaths and injuries by 2030. And within that, there is a global plan which is based on the safe system approach, which Stephen Cliff talked about. And within that, vehicles play a very important, they're one of the key pillars for action, including the full range of road infrastructure, road user behavior, speed management, and post-crash care. So it's a very holistic approach, and the global plan is something that we help contribute to, and it has a specific section on vehicles. But I would point out that safe systems in the global plan are not enough. I mean, personally, I would like to see the trajectory of vehicle production heading in that green forecast that we were highlighting. And to do that, I think we've also got to do something else in sustainable transport. And that is this other paradigm of avoid, shift, improve. We need to try and avoid unnecessary travel where we can, shift to cleaner and safer modes, and at the same time improve. And that is the whole case for maximizing the technology benefits, both in terms of safety and emissions. So for me, the challenge over the next decade is a combination of safe systems and this avoid, shift, and improve strategy. I would emphasize particularly that I think we have to do the avoid, shifting, improving all at the same time. Some who advocate this tend to push the improve bit and say, no, first avoid and shift. I think that's rather naive. We've actually got a challenge to do all of this at the same time. And they're not separate. Some of the technology improvement will actually encourage shift to other modes. Now, on to the global plan. Sorry, this is impossible to read, but it's there for you to look on our website. But it lists the main technologies and priorities on vehicle safety included in the global plan. And they recommend action, principally regulatory action in the list, around regulations for front and side crash test, for seat belts, for ISOFIX seat belts, which are latch systems as known here, also electronic stability control, autonomous emergency braking, pedestrian protection, in motorcycle helmets, of course, is a key issue, motorcycle anti-lock brakes, and also intelligent speed assistance. And I'd just like to highlight one or two of those things. Motorcycle anti-lock brakes, we've been talking a lot about four-wheel vehicles. If you had to identify probably the single most important vehicle safety technology over the next decade, it will be anti-lock brakes in motorcycles, particularly in Asia, where motorcycle deaths remain the majority, far exceeding passenger vehicle deaths. And it's pretty shocking, frankly, that a technology that's been around for years is still not mandatory. ABS is pretty much absent from most of Asia. It's not even regulated here, which I think is a shame, let's say. Europe has mandated ABS for bikes above 125cc. India has even done that. Actually, that in Asia doesn't really do enough because 80% of the machines in Southeast Asia are below 125cc. So what we want to see is ABS in bikes for all vehicles that can do more than 50 kilometers an hour. And it doesn't have to be high cost. You can have a one-pot system just working on the front wheel. But really, it's kind of scandalous that ABS in bikes is not ubiquitous already. And alongside helmet wearing, we need to see a really big push on that. And I must say, I'm intensely frustrated with the way in which the motorcycle industry has prevaricated and delayed on this issue. And they still do, and it's not acceptable. So big flag up, ABS really matters. I'd love to see the US legislating, if not for your own safety, but as a huge demonstration to the rest of the world. In the global plan, of course, it also says there in the fine print, very nice endorsement of the role of NCAPs. Now, this chart shows the challenge globally. It's in the house, we call this our sweetie chart. The little colored boxes, which do include a motorcycle in there, they represent the most priority vehicle standards, and they show who's doing what by market size. So China is up at the top, then USA, then the EU as a block, because after all, they're one regulatory zone, so it sort of makes sense to include them. And what you can see from this chart, all of the gaps, all of the holes, there are some countries there, like Mexico, Indonesia, and so on, with very few colored markings. So what we want by the end of the decade is a full house. We want this all the trays full of vehicle safety sweeties, as we would call it. And I would highlight also, there's one on the EU, third down, green, big historic moment coming in Europe on 6th of July, which is intelligent speed assistance is going to be mandatory in all new models and eventually all new vehicles. And it's a system where the vehicle, a combination of maps and cameras, will be able to detect the speed limit, slow the vehicle. It is overridable. But I think it's a very significant step in the second largest vehicle market worldwide, third largest, sorry, that this system is now coming in. And I would urge the US to start a debate on this. It's pleasing that in the NHTSA consultation document, there is a question about should we be thinking about ISA? My answer to that is yes. And if you want to see the evidence and look at all the benefits, just look at all the work behind the EU proposal. It's all been fully analyzed as highly cost beneficial. So ISA is something else that I think is worth flagging up. And I also highlight the G20 countries. It's actually 19 countries plus the EU. They account for about 90% of all vehicle production. And it's about 10 vehicle manufacturers, actually, globally. I mean, if we could lock the G20 leaders in a room, actually a bit difficult locking Putin and everyone else, but anyway. But if we get the G20, maybe lock him in a different room, but if we get the G20 leaders and the car manufacturers, send them to some remote exotic island, say, you can come back when you come up with a decent proposal to do this in the decade. Why not? And then finally, I'd like to have a sort of sigh of disappointment, not entirely unexpected, about the response of the car manufacturers as a whole industry represented through their body OICA, which is the body that represents car manufacturers at the United Nations. They lead for the car manufacturers in the UN. They speak for them. They attend the vehicle standards body. In October 2019, in a step that was rather encouraging, they issued a manifesto for global road safety. And that was good. It was the first time they'd ever done anything like that, and it was sort of ahead of the third Global Ministerial Conference. But when we looked at the details, there was a sort of slow exhalation and disappointment from me, certainly, and from many others, because it just totally lacked any ambition. It completely ignored a proposal made by the UN Special Envoy for Road Safety, Jean Todt, which was for the industry to take some voluntary initiatives. Why do we have to wait for governments to legislate for electronic stability control when it's already at 80% fitment? Why doesn't the industry just say, well, we're going to do this? The same could be the case for pedestrian protection. In the Stockholm meeting, the representative of OICA, who's now no longer there, said with a straight face, the industry doesn't support voluntary commitments. And I actually pointed out to him that that was a bit off the mark, because the very first pedestrian protection standards introduced were a voluntary agreement in the EU by manufacturers through ASEA, the European manufacturers body, which includes all the global manufacturers. So point one, it was done with pedestrian protection in Europe. Then here in this country, AEB, there was a voluntary commitment on autonomous emergency braking. He didn't appear to know that at all. And so really there's absolutely no reason why the industry couldn't collectively be showing up this week in the UN and saying, and here today we announce blah, blah, blah. But I'm afraid there's nothing like that. And then there was a table of regulatory action where they sort of subtly turning the tables on government, saying this is the table we would like you to apply regulations. And then they had various date lines in there. And what was remarkable was that they wanted 5 more years in 2019 before they would apply for governments to apply electronic stability control, and even 3 more years for front and side crash tests. That actually is behind market developments. It was behind the trend rate of growth that was already happening in the market. So basically, it was a do-nothing commitment. And I think the days of do-nothing commitments should be entirely over. And I've already highlighted motorcycle ABS and the, I think, frankly, disgraceful behavior of the motorcycle industry over ABS. We really need industry to step up in these emerging markets and to deliver levels of safety and standards that at least meet minimum requirements. And I really hope that the high-level meeting in New York can really galvanize the industry to show the leadership that the present is sorely missing. So with that, I would like to end with a great thank. Just say that there's a plug for the important meeting happening on Thursday and Friday in the UN, which our expectations for this are high, and we really hope that it will give a strong and clear message to governments, to industry, and to all stakeholders to really take the action needed to meet the target to halve road deaths and serious injuries by 2050. With that, I'd like to show you a short film which sort of symbolizes a bit some of the concerns we have. So, shall I wait here? Yes, here we go.
Global NCAP is performing today a new car-to-car crash test. In this opportunity, we have on one side the cheapest sedan from Hyundai sold in the US market, which is the Accent. This car is made in Mexico. And on the other side, we have the cheapest sedan from Hyundai sold in the Mexican market and all over Latin America. It's the Grand i10. This car comes from a plant in India. Why are we doing this? We want to assess the difference in terms of standard vehicle equipment, safety equipment, from one side of the border, US, which is a market where we know it's well regulated, and across the border in Mexico, where regulations are not as they are in the US. And according to the NCAP testing, definitely the results of cars are falling below what we understand should be the standard for Latin American markets.
So we're now well into the second UN Decade of Action for Road Safety. There's a global plan for that decade, and within that, some very clear recommendations on vehicle safety, which Global NCAP, the Towards Zero Foundation, is 100% behind. The recommendations include standard fitment of electronic stability control, progress on fitment of autonomous emergency braking, intelligent speed assistance, all these crash avoidance technologies, plus application of the minimum crash worthiness standards for occupant protection and also for pedestrian protection. So it's an impressive list of actions required by member states, also by industry, over the next decade ahead. So here you have the Mexican version of the Hyundai, least expensive version of a sedan that you can buy there. But unfortunately in the crash test you can see that the body shell has really crumpled extremely badly with the forces of the crash. The door area has collapsed, the A-pillar is bent, the steering wheel has moved back, and with just 2 airbags the level of protection in the occupant zone is really rather poor, with a high risk of fatal or serious injury. The contrast with this version, which is an American Hyundai, the body shell has really performed well. There are 6 airbags. You can see even the windscreen is more or less intact.
One reason why manufacturers might be doing these kind of differences across the border is one type of regulation in the Mexican market and the other one in the US market. And on top of that, we have also a difference in terms of consumer information. We believe that if in Mexico we have a much more powerful and much more broad consumer information, like for example the star ratings of Latin NCAP, as they do have consumers in the US, the difference, the gap will be much shorter, or probably they wouldn't exist.
And what we want to see is a world by 2030 where all of these regulations and standards and technologies are universally applied to all vehicles across the world. Great. Carla.
Thank you very much, David. And I think I may echo the comments of everyone at just how shocking that video is when you see that comparison of 2 vehicles that seemingly have the same name or you know, look to be the same. It's something that we see in Australia and New Zealand. And when you talk to people, when you talk to consumers, as I do, and you talk to your family and friends who are not in road safety, they're often very surprised that a vehicle that's got the same name might have different features because it's not something that you think of. So I think this really highlights both the role that NCAPs play and also the importance of the standards being as high as possible and as similar as possible across different markets. So with that, I will ask Stephen from Latin NCAP to come and address the group and speak about vehicle safety developments in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, and congratulations for the 30-year anniversary of ASEAN NCAP. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very honored to be here with this audience and with these amazing speakers, which I truly admire whenever they grab the microphone and start talking about what is really important, because it's a way of avoiding suffering. It's a way of saving lives, and what's something which we must really put all our efforts to sensibilize decision makers and the general public in order to be able to implement these standards, which we know are saving people. So I'm going to start with my presentation of the program Latin NCAP, which is my local NCAP. I'm from Mexico, and what we're doing and a roadmap for vehicle safety towards 2030. So we are part of the NCAP family, and we're one of the youngest programs from the NCAP family. We have just 10 years of existing, and we are the only one of the NCAPs which still doesn't have any support from any government whatsoever from the region. So it's really a big effort for us to keep on with the testing and continue with the protocols, making them advance, because still we have not been able to breach that market logic in which the car manufacturers are still not competing for car safety in our region. And this is part of what we are assessing right now in the current protocol. We have adult, child, pedestrian, and vulnerable road users protection assessment, as well as the safety assistance. We have a rating score system from 0 to 5 stars, and we're focusing always on the basic model that we can find in the region in order to test it, because that's our standard. We have to test the basic features which cars are equipped in the region. And we're covering all Latin America, from Mexico all the way to the south of Chile, Argentina, and of course the Caribbean. And after 10 years of testing, here's one big highlight, which is a case of success, as we say. It's the top-selling car, the top-selling model in Brazil, which is actually it's the biggest market in the region. And there we can see how it performed on 2017, acquiring 0 stars for adult protection and just 3 stars for child protection. And after being tested by Latin NCAP, we could see how it slowly evolved in order to accomplish the 5 stars for adult protection and child protection just in 2 years, which we see that this is the role of the NCAPs, to really push the market or insert the market into a logic of improving the car safety, which is being offered as a standard fitment in our markets. This is the new protocol right now. We used to have 2-star ratings for adult protection and child protection. Now we have only a single star rating system with 4 boxes which are assessing the protection given to the different type of users, pedestrian and vulnerable road users, child child occupants, and of course adult protection. And also we're testing now. We're beginning to test the advanced driving assistance systems, which is the purple box that you can see there. And now it's the most stringent protocol that we have implemented, because with one single of those boxes which doesn't go to a certain level, it penalizes the overall rating of the car tested. And as a result of our last implementation of the protocol, of the latest protocol, we can see how cars have not been able to perform as well as before, when we were basically testing passive safety. Now, when we're focusing on other aspects of assistant driving systems, or the level of protection given to vulnerable road users, then we can see that our most of the cars we have tested under the latest protocol have been poorly performing, and that's basically because there's a deficiency in the electronic stability control, and also a deficiency in the performing of the lateral impact test. And what we have seen over these 10 years is a very interesting process in which the car manufacturers are voluntary changing, improving the cars that we have tested in the program. We have covered more than 60% of the sales market over these 10 years, and since 2010, 57% of the tests are voluntary manufactured tests. And speaking of the latest protocol, we have the commitment of 7 manufacturers, of 7 cars that will undergo an improvement due to the poor safety rating that they undergone on the latest protocol. And it's interesting also that more than 55% of the tested models have been improved after a Latin NCAP test. And considering only those cars that were selected by our program to be tested, that is, cars which are not volunteered by the industry, 76% of those models were improved once they were tested by the program. And what's coming now on the following years? We're gonna make we're gonna adopt a more stringent protocols, and we'll be looking for other types of protection given to adult protection, and also we'll be assessing more advanced driving assistance systems technologies that we're making them. We'll be assessing them if they are standard or not, because if they're not standard, then even though the car we test has that fitment of technology, it won't be able to score for the whole model. So that's one way we are pulling the market in order to comply with more stringent technologies. And also we're making a more heavier and faster barrier inside impact, which will be very hard to comply with for the car makers. And we're going to be adopting in the next years the single most difficult test to pass by car manufacturers, which is the oblique side pole impact test, and there is more coming. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mexico profile, given that the car we just saw is sold widely in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. The Grand I-10, which we just saw that had a very poor performing in the car-to-car crash, which is a test that's been crashed at 50 kilometers an hour. So that's the standard speed limit that we have in the primary roads in Mexico City, for example. So and even though at such speed, it has such a bad rating, and it puts, of course, the adult or the adult occupants at risk of severe injury or even death. So that's the result of something that we have witnessed along all the process of regulatory improvement and legislation and the making of legislation in our country, where we have seen a lot of interference of the industry from the industry association manufacturers, which is called AMIA in Mexico. And we have seen them in the latest update of the NOM 194, which is the national standard for car safety. We were not able to push forward certain technologies that they have been standard for the American market for more than a decade, like the stability control, or also here in the US, like stability control and pedestrian protection in Europe. And and also I want to highlight that this car, the Grand i10 from Hyundai in Mexico, accounts for almost 50% of the sales of the car company in our country. Talking about the hatchback and sedan model from the Grand i10, which it's really something that we should be working in order to make visible to consumers, to decision makers, to the industry, so that it can change the performance, the safety performance of those cars. And there's a little bit of numbers that we have worked through in Mexico. There are still, for the last 5 years or so, we still have 16,000 unacceptable road deaths each year, 65% of which are vulnerable road users, and more than 40% of those deaths are pedestrian deaths. In an assessment of the car market in Mexico, done with El Poder del Consumidor, which is the organization I also belong to, we were able, together with Latin NCAP, to determine that at least from 2015 to 2020, we saw there was a sales of 1.5 million poor rating cars, poor Latin NCAP rating cars sales in those 6 years. 1.5 million, which accounts for over 30% or 40% of the market in Mexico. And this has to stop. We have to stop the double standard practice from the industry. That is, as you saw, that car that is produced in Mexico and it's commercialized in the US, it has a very good standard performance of car protection, of adult protection. Not so the car that it's being sold in Mexico. And it's not even produced in Mexico. It's produced elsewhere. It's produced in India, and we're allowing low safety car or very poor safety cars to enter the Mexican market, and it's not even part of the national market. It's not even produced in our country. And this is part of what has been the new national standard of car safety, which the publication is still pending. We're waiting for the publication after more than 3 years of work with the government. And we were able to make mandatory the electronic stability control, the child restraint system anchorages, and the pole side impact test and tire pressure monitoring system. Yet 2 things happened due to the interference of the industry. There's going to be a very delayed implementation of those standard fitment technologies. We're talking about that only models. It will start the complete phasing in of the electronic stability control and the pole side impact test. Will the complete phasing in will be by 2028, the year models 2028. That is 17 years later than the complete phasing in of the electronic stability control that needs regulated here, and the Department of Transport regulated here in the US. And of course, we're missing the pedestrian protection standard, we're missing a stronger information consumer system that would include the NCAP ratings, and we don't have, of course, any advanced driving assistant technologies, and the delayed implementation of those standards. Fortunately, we were able also to work during the same period in the General Mobility and Road Safety Law, and that was that was very interesting because the industry was focusing mainly on the national standard, that 194, which is the specific regulation of car safety. But they didn't believe that we were able to do that as civil society organizations and consumers organizations, road safety organizations, family victims organizations. We were advocating with the decision makers, legislators, in order to include what was not included as a fitment standard for the national standard on car safety. So like that, now we have the protection assessment performance that should be mandatory and independent according to the law. Information consumer system, which gives the opportunity to develop a car labeling system that would help make the consumers aware of the risks implied in the models that are on the market, and it's focusing on vulnerable road users, and it's based on international best practices. So we're hoping now that we will be able to push forward the NCAP rating system in Mexico, or to make it to make progress, because we know now we're asking more. It's not only, the regulations are not enough to have a very safe, a safer car, and to protect adequately pedestrians and occupants and vulnerable road users. We know we need of the test, the NCAP test, in order to make our market mature, and that they start competing for the for offering better safety standards. And in that sense, it would be very beneficial for us in Mexico and the rest of the region of Latin America that the U.S. would take action in specifically the protection of vulnerable road users and pedestrians. I was very happy to hear that the NHTSA, the NCAP protocols are undergoing a major update, which was already needed for years, and that will include the protection technology, the pedestrian protection technologies, like the autonomous emergency braking, which is great, but also, and this is our invitation as someone who lives in Mexico, that it should be it would be very, very good for our region if the U.S. would also implement the pedestrian protection standard for all cars, not only in the testing in the NCAP assessment, but also as a regulation, because we know it saves lives. And also there's the option for those cars which cannot comply with the standard protection standard, the pedestrian protection standard. There's also the autonomous emergency braking standard, which could, for those vehicles which by design cannot comply with such standard, they can be fitted with the advanced autonomous emergency braking for pedestrians. So it is possible, and the fact that we were not able to include the pedestrian protection in our own national standard, it's due not only because of the industry's interference, but also because there is no federal motor vehicle safety standard that includes the pedestrian protection in the U.S. And that's something where the U.S. have been stalling in protecting the pedestrian and vulnerable road users. Just in 2020, I was reading that over 7,000 pedestrians were killed on the American roads, and it is so important now to start the assessing in the NCAPs of the pedestrian protection standard and the pedestrian protection technologies so that the rest of the region we could follow, because if the US doesn't do it, it's nearly too impossible that we were able to implement it in our country, which I saw it with my own eyes when I was in the working groups advocating for the pedestrian protection standard, even though we presented lots of evidence of the benefits, the cost benefits, economical benefits, the legal base that we could also ask for something which is more stringent in our regulation than the regulations of the US, even though that's legally possible due to the tightly integrated markets of the US and Mexico especially, but also from the rest of the region. We were not able to push for the pedestrian protection standard, which, and with this I'm closing my intervention, it's the standard which really democratizes car safety, because with the pedestrian protection and technologies and standard for protecting vulnerable road users, we will be really starting to democratize car safety once we are protecting not only those which travel inside, the occupants of the cars, but also all the other road users which share the roads with the vehicles. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and gracias.
Well, thank you, Stefan, and thank you very much for all the hard work that you're doing. And I think all of us here would agree that there is so much work to do, and it is such a big push, but you can see that the commitment is strong, and so, you know, there will be change over time. So best of luck for your continued push, and anything we can do to support you, we will. Matthew. Matthew will be speaking about European priorities for vehicle safety in the decade ahead. There's
The clicker.
the clicker.
Right,
Thank
see where
you,
we go.
Matthew.
Right, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's see whether we've got our slides working. Right, please go on. Right. So it's certainly a pleasure to be here with these my illustrious colleagues, and I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing in Europe, stepping up a gear, because I'm going to talk to you about definitely the art of the possible and where we see we go next in Europe and how we deliver that sort of 50 by 30 objective. So Euro NCAP, we've been very, very successful. We've probably led the way in a lot of the global NCAP's work. We're celebrating 25 years, so we've got our own celebrations this year. Obviously, very much a consumer-focused program, mixture of governments and motor clubs and insurers. And I'm from the United Kingdom, and I represent the British insurers, an organisation called Thatcham Research, but I'm also on the board of Euro NCAP, which is why I'm here. So let's just look about some of our successes. If you look about those lines on the right-hand side, if you can see those, that's standard fit ADAS across our market and how well the vehicle manufacturers have engaged with us. So we introduced ADAS in 2009 with ESC. AEB, we introduced, we were the first organisation, I think, to bring AEB testing forward, 2014. It's now standard fit on practically every single vehicle we test in the European market. And it's not just AEB, it's pedestrian protection for AEB, it's lane support systems, and its speed assistance systems. So it's a huge amount of technology penetration. You cannot come to Europe and buy a new car without this technology on board. We've also got an expansion of members. Obviously, I'm representing the UK, part of Europe, Brexit or no Brexit. We are still part of the landmass of Europe. But we've got new members from Austria and Norway, so we are expanding. And governments see the benefits of NCAP programs. But the relationship between what we do and what regulation does has grown over time. We've implemented many of the new technologies into the NCAP program, which are not part of our group rating and our type approval process. So we introduced whiplash testing, physical pedestrian testing, AEB in 2014. We added cyclist protection in 2016. 2020, we have a mobile deformable barrier that's looking at some of the challenges around compatibility. We've now added rescue as well as part of that to ensure that in that golden hour post-collision, people are supported. But moving into 2023, because we're in the process now of working on our new roadmap. So these are some of the new things that we are implementing this year, but these lead forward to our 2025 roadmap, which I'll talk to you about, some of the new things that we're pushing forward to go even further. So we've got things like brain injury assessment, BIC calculation. We've got new protection for vulnerable road users, looking at powered two-wheelers. We've got innovations in child presence detection. That's calling for sensors to stop leaving children in hot cars. And we've got new AEB forms looking at turning across paths. So not only front to rear AEB safety, but we're also looking at turning across the path of a vehicle or a cyclist or even a pedestrian. And finally, driver state monitoring. That is one of the key technologies in the future, driver state monitoring, understanding what's the driver's state, how is the driver responding, is the driver intoxicated, or is the driver engaged in the driving task? Because with that, you can tune the interventions to get rid of some of the annoyance that some of these ADAS features some drivers find. So in terms of our rating evolution, we are taking the manufacturers with us. Most of the vehicles we're testing in our market are 4- or 5-star cars. We've got very few vehicles on our market with lower performance, and they tend to be older models in our market that manufacturers are continuing to rehash. But manufacturers are very much engaged with this program, even though we have far higher levels of the required safety standards on our vehicles than any other market. And bear in mind, this technology has to be fitted as standard. So 68% of the vehicles sold in the European market, including the United Kingdom, are 5-star vehicles. You can see a further 15% are 4-star vehicles. We only have 7% of the sold vehicles on our market, passenger cars, that are unrated. And we're moving into new areas. So in 2020, we started assisted driving assessments, level 2 assessments, the sort of assisted driving technologies you see on upper market vehicles like Teslas with their autopilot system, badly named autopilot system, but also Mercedes and Volvo and many other manufacturers fitting that level 2 technology. And we're also moving into commercial vehicle safety. In 2020, we started testing commercial vans, panel vans, cargo vans, and we've integrated that into our testing standard. So it's not just now passenger cars, we're looking at commercial vehicles as well. But now into this decade, we need to think about the expansion of NCAP, and we move from safer cars to safer mobility. And there's lots of drivers there. We've got the needs of automation, the needs of inclusivity, of commercial vehicles. We've got new technology, new capabilities, car-to-car communication, car-to-ground communication, and new technologies on vehicles. There's obviously lots of barriers as well that we've also got to consider. You've got new players in the market. Are they going to follow the same trends that the existing vehicle manufacturers have followed? And we've also got to maintain that consumer trust. We do get feedback about some of the ADAS systems that we encourage manufacturers to fit, and we need to think about getting the consumer to buy into this, because at the end of the day, they are our customer. So some of the things that we've been talking about. We're talking about changing how we do those ratings and new rating scheme. I'll get onto some more details into that. But looking at how do we integrate assisted and automated driving into our testing. How do we integrate safe driving and post-crash rescue? How do we look at cyber security and data issues? What about expansion of the vehicle fleet? We've got vans. Are we going to look at heavy commercial vehicles? And then we need to think about mobility as a service. We're all talking about automation and mobility as a service and pods and automated vehicles. We'll need to assess those because consumers are already asking us, are these mobility services, are they going to be as safe? So the first and most important thing we're considering for 2025 is a complete new rating system, adopting the Haddon matrix, which my colleagues from IIHS will probably be well aware of. But very important, we move from the traditional way of assessing the car to assessing the various aspects of a crash. So from safe driving, how do you keep the driver safe? What technologies can support the driver? Speed assistance systems, we already look at that. What about occupant status monitoring? Crash avoidance, that's the AEB and the ADAS standards, integrating that. The crash protection, the good old crash test, the crash dummies, how do we improve the protection of people involved in the crash? And then tertiary safety, post-crash, how do you protect people in that golden hour? What more can we do? So it's those 4 states of driving, and obviously what we're trying to do is push everything to the left, make it so everyone's just driving safely and never needs to rely on crash technology. So safe driving, look at some of the technologies. In-cabin monitoring will be one of the most important things. So we can look at the driver's state, we can look at the passenger state. We can see whether drivers are looking and paying attention. If drivers are looking and paying attention, you probably don't need to warn that driver. But if they're not paying attention, you probably need to intervene on behalf of the driver. That's the role that technology plays in this. It also plays a very important role all the way through from safe driving to post-crash safety. What about eCall? What about the expansion of eCall to deCall? So you can let the emergency services know who's in the car, how severe was the crash, and whether people will need medical attention. So we can go way beyond. When we talk about collision avoidance, we've got AEB on our vehicles, as you've seen, since 2014. But we can make it more robust. What about different weather conditions? What about integrating vehicle technology? What about combining stricter HMI requirements, making sure drivers understand and there's common interfaces between vehicles? What about things like pedal misapplication, making sure that drivers are not going to misuse the vehicles and end up with in collisions? We've got changes to our impact dummies, using new crash dummies, replacing the hybrid 3s with Thor dummies, and not only looking at the 50th percentile male that we adopt now, but also looking at the 5th female Thor, which is so difficult to say, 5th female Thor. That's your fault, Chris. And looking at new side impact capabilities as well. And then finally, looking at tertiary safety, looking at improvements, emergency services. Very important now with more battery electric vehicles on the market, making sure that the emergency services understand the threat or otherwise of the vehicle they're going to come across, and making sure information's available to them before they get to the crash site so they can deal with deactivating batteries and getting to any injured occupants as soon as possible. And we're working with CTIF on those standardised ways of imparting that information. We're even discussing the use of QR codes on the exterior of the vehicle that would put down the information about where the cut lines are on the vehicle, where the emergency services should access high voltage batteries to protect them and protect people on board. So this very quick fly through is showing you where we're going in terms of our roadmap. And you can see there are many, many things there. that we're discussing, but you could see how we can lift safety to the next level. Let's not just think about passenger cars, let's think about the other road users and the other vehicles. So some of the things we're doing is we're looking at truck and highway safety labels. This is for heavy trucks, for semis, or lorries, as I would say, in the UK. But we're looking at protecting not only the occupants of these vehicles, but obviously the vehicles that they come into contact with. So we want to see AEB systems on these trucks. We want to see lane support systems. We want to see driver monitoring systems. But there's a difference between the trucks that come into cities and the trucks that are out on the highways, and they have different crashes. So we have a rating scheme that individualises truck safety in the city and highway safety, because there's different technologies to address the different crashes. And finally, we need to look at that mobility as a service. How can we now go from a B2C conversation, a business to consumer conversation, to a B2B conversation? How do we start talking with other businesses? So we need to think about the people who will be running connected vehicle services. We need to think about the truck operators. We need to think about, ultimately, the bus operators as well. So a kite mark for safety assurance. Continue the brand that consumers trust, the Euro NCAP brand, to ensure that all consumers get that. So it's about safety for all consumers and not just car occupants. So we're on this journey with this roadmap. We're now on the final piece, the consultation piece. We'll be publishing this roadmap at the end of this year to tell the vehicle manufacturers what they need to do to make safe cars for Europe towards that 50 by 30 goal. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthew. Fantastic progress. And a lot on the agenda for Euro NCAP. It's worth mentioning that ANCAP or ANCAP aligned its testing protocols with Euro NCAP in 2020, and we intend to keep that alignment. There are always slight deviations that are needed in the local market due to regulatory differences, but we're going to be busy too. We'll be right with you through that, and I think the especially interesting and invigorating, maybe, move into a wider range of vehicles, into, you know, going up the mass spectrum is the way I describe it, into the heavier categories, when we think about all of the NCAP programs and the gains that they achieve in terms of reducing deaths and serious injuries. Where's the next? We're always looking for the next thing that we're going to apply in the light vehicle space, but moving up into heavier vehicles is clearly such an opportunity to really make a difference. So we'll be looking very carefully at those plans as well. So with that, I will just slightly note that we're tracking pretty well for time. So hopefully that's not going to put the mockers on anyone, as we say in Australia. But I will put the audience on notice that means that we might have time for a few questions at the end. So for people in the room, please start to engage your brain, because we will be able to take questions from the floor. And if it is possible, and if there are people out there online who want to make questions, we can quite possibly feed them through as well. So start thinking about that. This is two-way participation, not just one way. And with that, I will ask David to come and present perspectives on US vehicle safety in the decade ahead. Thank you, David.
There we go. One of these arrows has to work.
Yeah, it's the one on the right, I think.
There we go. All right. So Carla should have never told me we were running ahead of schedule. You should never do that. Yeah. Well, it's very nice to be here with all my colleagues this morning and to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety with respect to working on our road safety problem. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a walk through history of successes we've had and then talk a little bit about how we're starting to address some of the challenges that we continue to face here in the U.S. market. For those of you that don't know, we're probably one of the unique NCAPs in the way that we are funded. We get our funding from the insurance industry. Those companies, roughly more than 90% of the companies that write insurance policies in the United States, as well as a few companies that write auto policies in Canada. That's where our funding comes from. Our mission is very much focused on saving lives and preventing harm through our research and consumer evaluation programs. It's very clear that we are headed in the wrong direction here in the United States. There were a lot of problems that were exacerbated during the pandemic. We saw lots of issues with speeding on our roadways, more crashes involving impairment, more people not wearing their seatbelts. But we've been going in the wrong direction now for more years than just the last couple when the pandemic was going on. We had a low number of fatalities in this country back around 2014, slightly less than 33,000. Since that time, we've gone up 31%. And so we've been on this wrong direction course now for a while. I'm here today as part of Global NCAP, whose mission, as you've heard, is to really push automakers to produce safe vehicles around the globe. So let me start with that aspect of our work and talk about occupant protection, the work that we do to make sure that you are protected, whether you're in a vehicle that is struck from the front, from the rear, from the side, or happens to roll over during a crash. We started testing vehicles in the mid-1990s and have developed tests to address all of those scenarios. Currently, you have to receive our highest rating, which is a good rating, in all 6 of the crashworthiness tests that we conduct. If you want to be eligible as an automaker to receive our Top Safety Pick or Top Safety Pick Plus award. And this is what the automakers strive for when they have us test their vehicles. And over time, if you look at each test we've rolled out, the automakers have responded. They've come on board, they've figured out how to improve the safety of their vehicles, how to protect the occupants in those vehicles in the various crash scenarios that we are running. And what you find is that as new cars improve in terms of safety, we eventually get to a point where the entire fleet that is out there on our roadway is safer. It takes a long time. The average age of a vehicle in the U.S. now is around 12 years. And so it just takes time for the fleet to turn over and for these newer, safer cars to become the predominant vehicles that are on the roadway. For us, it's really important that we complete the circle of safety. And what I mean by that is making sure that we look at what's happening in real-world crashes and are able to say with some certainty and confidence that if you have a good vehicle versus a poor-rated vehicle, that you're going to be safer out there in the real world. And what this slide shows are a couple of those scenarios. And so your risk of dying in a head-on crash is 46% lower if you are in a vehicle that has been rated good in our head-on crash, moderate overlap crash tests that we run at the facility. compared to being in a vehicle that's rated poor. If you're in a vehicle that is rated good in our side crash test, your fatality risk is 70% lower than if you're in a poor rated vehicle in that particular test. And so yes, our results and our ratings translate into lives saved on the actual roadway. That does not mean that there is no room for improvement, that we are done. And so where are we going as we look to the future here? There are a couple areas that I want to focus on. One of those is side impact. So despite those numbers that I just cited, and despite the fact that since we have introduced this test in the U.S., the number of side impact deaths has gone down 44%. We think there is more that can be done. We think there are further improvements that can be had in this particular type of crash. Why is that? Well, side crashes today are occurring at higher speeds. When you look at real-world crash data, they are occurring at higher speeds, and they are occurring with heavier vehicles. We are the land of pickup trucks and large SUVs. That's what's out there on our roadways today. And so when you look at those types of collisions, side impact collisions, with those types of vehicles, the severity is much greater than what we are currently testing for. So we've updated that test. We rolled this out last year. It's our new Side 2.0 test, as we're calling it. We're running it at a higher speed. We have designed a heavier barrier, and those two things combined create about 82% more energy in the collision. Does it make a difference? You better believe it. Of the 38 small and mid-size SUVs that got a good rating in our original side crash test, only 11 of those vehicles got a good rating in our new, tougher Side 2.0 test. So the automakers have some work to do to get back to having a good rating in all of their vehicles across their fleets, but we are confident that they will be able to do that. The other area that we are looking at is the rear passenger in a frontal test. For years, we have focused on the driver and the front seat occupant. That makes sense. That's where the greatest risk was when it came to being injured in a crash. But we have put technologies in the front seat now. We have lots of airbags. We have all sorts of restraint technologies, including things like pre-crash tensioners and load limiters. Those are all in the front seat now. And what's happened is the shift in risk of injury is now in the rear seat. So it's time for us to shift our focus. How do we do a better job of protecting rear seat passengers? This is where we often have our children in the vehicle. This is where we may have elderly parents in the vehicle. It's where a lot of us ride when we're taking those rideshare services. So let's think about what we can do to improve the safety of the rear seat. So we have started working on this. We're going to roll this out, a new test, later this year to focus on all of these issues. We think there are countermeasures that are already available that many of the manufacturers will be able to employ quickly and do well in this test moving forward. But the test is simply our moderate overlap test, where about 40% of the front of the vehicle strikes a barrier, and we will be including a female dummy seated in the rear seat behind the driver. And so this will be the new test that will roll out later this year. So both this test and the Side 2.0 test will become part of the new top safety pick criteria moving forward. The other area that we are working on, and this is perhaps one as one who's been involved in this field for a long time, it continues to frustrate me, that if you look at seatbelt use in the United States, front seat seatbelt use, about 90% of those seated in the front seat are wearing their belts. But if you look at crash data, almost half of the front seat fatalities are unbelted. There is a real disconnect here, and we've got to do more to change that. And so earlier this year, we've developed a series of ratings, and we've started to rate vehicles now in terms of their seatbelt reminder systems. We did a lot of research trying to figure out, did you need a mechanical device to get people to buckle up, something like a buckle up to shift into gear, or a speed limiting interlock system? What we found is just make the chime annoying enough, and you will land long enough, and you will get people to buckle up. And so this is what we're doing, is we're moving to a rating system, as you can see here, where we will reward those automakers that are putting extended chime information in their vehicles. We want to get to a point where you get an acceptable rating if you have a 90-second audible warning to get you to buckle up. And then you get to that good rating if you also provide the driver status information. If there's a change in status in the second row of the vehicle, so if your child unbuckles their seatbelt for some reason, you get a warning as a driver. That will get you to that good rating. We believe that just a small change in getting those numbers up will get us to a point where we can save 1,600 lives annually on our roadways. The other area that I want to then shift to is collision avoidance. So we've moved from occupant protection and continuing to do the work that we do on that side of the house to now thinking about the vehicle technology and crash prevention, some of the stuff that Matthew was showing. And so we've continued to test headlights and front crash prevention systems. And one of the things I will say is that, again, the automakers have responded here, is this is part of our top safety pick criteria. And so you have to have well-performing headlights and you have to have well-performing front crash prevention systems now to qualify for those awards. The one that we've been testing the longest is probably the vehicle-to-vehicle automatic emergency braking, and it is effective. We can look at the crash data that are out there, and for those kinds of crashes that involve a vehicle striking the rear of another vehicle, for passenger vehicles, they can reduce those kinds of crashes by about 50%. For large trucks that are outfitted with these systems, they can reduce those kinds of crashes by about 40%. So they are working when we look at real-world data, and the automakers, as I said, have responded. They have continued to improve their systems. They've continued to make them more prevalent across their fleet. Part of the reason is what David referred to earlier. This was the voluntary agreement that IIHS worked with NHTSA and the automakers to get them to commit to pretty much putting AEB on all of the vehicles that they sell in the U.S. market by September of this year. They're well on their way. Many of the automakers have already met this commitment, and we believe the others will get there by this fall. That's the good news. The bad news is, and this is something to remember about all of these technologies, it will take a long time for them to be prevalent in every vehicle that is out there on the roadway. Our estimate is it's going to take another 2 decades before we see technologies like AEB on 90% of the vehicles that are out there on the roadway. And so it just takes, again, a long time for this to be prevalent in the entire fleet. We've continued to work on pedestrian AEB. So vehicle AEB we had tested for some time. In the last few years, we started looking at pedestrian AEB. And again, the automakers have come along. You can see how much they've improved their systems just between 2019 and 2022. And once again, we've been able to look. Maybe we've been able to look. I will stop here for a minute. One of the reasons that, and I think Stefan's comments about Latin America and the pedestrian problem in Mexico, we have a huge pedestrian problem in this country that is growing much faster than our total roadway safety problem. Pedestrian fatalities are up 79% since we hit a low point back in 2009. it is growing faster than almost any of our other road safety problems. And it's why we think the pedestrian AEB is so important. We've also been able to look at the effectiveness of these systems through real-world crash data again. And what we find is that, sure enough, these systems can reduce pedestrian injury crashes by about 30%. So positive news on that front. Bad news on that front, though, is most pedestrian fatalities occur at dark, at night, under low light conditions. And so one of the things that we're now doing and moving forward with is testing these systems at night. Are they going to work as well at night as they do in the daytime? And so this is research that has been underway for a little while. We're in the middle of developing the top safety pick criteria that will be rolled out later this year. So the automakers are not only going to have systems that perform well and detect and respond to pedestrians in the daytime, they also have to do so for nighttime crashes. Then I want to talk about headlight evaluations. And so this sometimes comes up because we get the question of why headlights? So why headlights is actually pretty simple. We do about a quarter of our driving at night when we need our headlights, and yet it's when half of the fatalities occur. And so it's much riskier to be out there on the roadway at night. The automakers have continued to improve their headlights since we have started testing them a few years ago. And again, we've been able to show that we can reduce the risk at nighttime by about 20% if you're in a vehicle that has good rated headlights versus a poor rated headlight vehicle. And so that's a huge difference in terms of your risk in being out there on the roadway. And so this is something we will continue to move forward on. And then the final piece on the technology side is we're now moving into more and more vehicles that are out there that are with partial automation systems, or what SAE defines as level 2. And so these are systems that combine the ability to have accelerating and braking capability with steering capability. And so you put those two things together and you're at level 2, or what we define as partial automation. We know from research that we've conducted that drivers who are using these systems are likely to drive faster. They're likely to look away from the roadway more frequently and for longer periods of time, duration-wise. And then they are also likely to engage in more distracting behaviors. There are currently no regulations on what these systems should look like, what they should allow the driver to do in terms of being disengaged from the driving task. Remember, these are not, and I repeat, are not self-driving systems. These are just more advanced driving assistance systems. The driver must remain in the loop at all times. So one of the things that we came out with earlier this year were a set of criteria. The 6 things that you see here that are really trying to keep the driver engaged in the driving task and to make sure that the system works with the driver cooperatively to create a safe driving environment. And we're going to begin rating vehicles with these systems later this year. One of the challenges, as many of you probably know, is just getting vehicles these days that have this kind of technology on it, with the supply chain shortages and everything else that's going on. But we think this is really important because, again, there's no regulation out there right now. And so we want to do our part in kind of our pseudo-regulator role and get information out there to consumers about what these systems can and cannot do and how we rate them with respect to the 6 criteria shown here. So all of that sounds really good when it comes to improving vehicle safety. But I think the biggest thing to remember is that improving vehicle safety alone is not going to get us out of this roadway safety epidemic that we are in currently here in the U.S. We need a different approach. And so IIHS integrated systems thinking into our research and our consumer evaluation programs back in 2018. And so we're excited when we heard Dr. Cliff talk about it this morning. We're excited to see the US DOT here is coming along now, has that as part of their strategy to begin systems thinking. Other countries, including Australia and the Netherlands, have been involved in this kind of thinking for a very long time. And they have driven their fatality numbers down quite a bit as a result of that different strategy and different way of thinking about things. So that's what we are doing. Again, it's putting the human being at the center, and there's no reason, and creating these safety redundancies in the infrastructure, in the vehicle, in behaviors. We're trying to do all of these things collectively to address specific problems in our roadway system. No human being should lose their life because they make a mistake or a system owner makes a mistake. And that's what we're trying to prevent. But we've got to address two big problems as part of this systems thinking. We've got to address speed. Speed continues to be about a quarter of the fatalities, speed-related fatalities, or about a quarter of the total fatality picture in this country. We got to be smarter about how we set speed limits. Since we removed the national maximum speed limit in this country in the early 90s, we have lost approximately 40,000 lives on our roadways. Policy matters, and we've got to get smarter. We know that if we can do simple things like bringing the speed limit down by about 5 miles per hour, we can reduce the top end of that distribution, the most egregious speeders, by about 30%. Giving them more time to respond, giving them more time to detect hazards, and reducing the severity of collisions on our roadways. We also have to have the will to put in proven and effective countermeasures. Automated enforcement is one of those that has been utilized in many of those countries that I was talking about. It makes a difference. We know that. We just have to have the will to do it, and do it in a way that is equitable in this country. The other issue that we have to address in this country that we've really ignored, I think, for a very long time now, is impairment. We made significant progress in the 1980s and the 1990s with regards to reducing impairment. But when you look at the last 2 decades, maybe we're going to look at the last 2 decades. We're stagnated. We've really made no movement. About 30% of our fatalities continue to be alcohol impairment related. And so we have to do more to address that. And there are technologies that are out there that are coming that will address this problem in the future. Things like passive detection for vehicles. That has made huge strides in the last decade, and it will be ready for implementation very soon. But again, like all these other technologies, it's going to take a couple decades for this to be in the fleet. And for this particular technology to be widespread in the U.S. is going to mandate regulation. It's going to have to. Otherwise, it will not be implemented. So let's use technology we have today. We can do more with ignition interlocks, and we can get to a point where we can drive the fatality numbers down from about 3% with the use of those today to 16%. Bottom line, we need a comprehensive approach to save lives today and get us out of this epidemic. We at IIHS will continue to apply systems thinking to the roadway safety challenges that we have in the U.S. Yes, we will continue to test and evaluate vehicles and to put out ratings to consumers on vehicles, but we will also work on improving behaviors, improving our infrastructure, educating consumers, and informing policymakers. Driving change in road safety requires this kind of comprehensive approach. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There's some really interesting statistics that you mentioned there, and in terms of the pickups, that's certainly a trend that we see in Australia as well. There is a an increasing interest in purchasing large American-style pickups. So thank you for that. Now, next we have Kelly Hesler, who has very kindly come in at the last minute to provide some closing remarks on behalf of Jennifer Homendi. Jennifer, unfortunately, has been unable to attend at the last minute, but we have Kelly, and Kelly is representing the National Transport Safety Board. Are we using that mic? Okay, great. Okay, excellent. I will hand over to Kelly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for having us. The chair sends her sincere regrets for not being able to be here. She was called on the NTSB GO team to launch to the site of the Amtrak derailment in Missouri. So she's doing our mission work. So I do not hope to be as effective as a messenger as her, but I am honored to help carry her important message to all of you. I will deliver the remarks as prepared, which means in the first person, so you'll have to suspend your disbelief just a little bit. So thank you. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, David, and the Towards Zero Foundation and Global NCAP, and all of our safety partners here who are working on vehicle safety worldwide. It is wonderful to be here together again after so much time away with our partners from around the world, because we really are in this traffic safety crisis together. Around the world, 3,700 people die on the road every single day. And in the US, 117 people every day. Nearly 43,000 people die annually. And more than 3 million others are seriously injured. Our roads are among the deadliest. And while many of our partners saw steep declines in the number of road fatalities during the pandemic, ours rose sharply. You heard some of the data earlier. Pedestrian fatalities last year were up 13%. For motorcyclists, up 9%. Bicyclist fatalities, deaths from speeding-related crashes, and alcohol-involved crashes, all three of those were up 5% each. Unrestrained occupants, 3% increase. And fatalities and crashes involving trucks, up 13% year over year. It's unconscionable, and it's preventable. And we all know the risk is not evenly distributed. Around the world, the most vulnerable populations and communities are at the highest risk of injury or death. To save lives in the US and around the world, and to do so equitably, requires a paradigm shift. A shift from the conventional approach, which has failed all road users, to the safe system approach, which prioritizes the lives of people over traffic. The safe system approach is on the NTSB's most wanted list of transportation safety improvements, and as you've heard, it's been embraced by the US Department of Transportation and the National Roadway Safety Strategy, and we are very grateful for that. And all of us are here today because we know that safe vehicles are a major part of a safe system. In fact, it's one of the best opportunities we have to save lives on the roads and move the safety needle. The statistics I just cited about deaths and injuries related to speeding, impairment, seatbelt use, and among vulnerable road users, safety technologies can help address all of those areas. And that's why require collision avoidance and connected vehicle technologies is on NTSB's most wanted list as well. The US was once a leader when it came to ensuring safer vehicles. But the heartbreaking truth is that we've fallen behind. We've fallen behind in crash testing and in ensuring these life-saving technologies are standard on all vehicles. We have a moral obligation to do better. The US is one of the world's largest suppliers and consumers of passenger vehicles. and as we've heard, our partners in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere are setting the standard, providing consumers with the information they need to keep their families safe, and giving vehicle manufacturers safety goals and performance minimums to achieve. Now, I'm not saying we don't have passionate, incredible advocates working on vehicle safety here in the United States, and we do, starting with David and Dr. Cliff. But what I am saying is that the US NCAP program is dangerously close to irrelevance. Now, to be fair, NHTSA, under Dr. Cliff's leadership, is setting out to change all that, as we heard, and we all know that NCAPs are a powerful tool to save lives, so the will is there. The plan to update US NCAP proposes many meaningful changes, and yet it does not go far enough. That's why I'm here today. It's why the NTSB exists. We call other government agencies, organizations, everyone to account when we fall short on safety, and we have. We do this to save lives. And today, I'm calling for the United States to return as a leader in vehicle safety. Now, to be clear, how we got here is bigger than any one individual government agency department. It's society level. Here in the United States, we spend far too much energy on just one part of the safe system, and that is on the actions of individual road users. And we can see this when we over-rely on enforcement and driver education. Our unwillingness to zoom out and see the bigger picture is keeping us from the UN goal, and it's keeping us from zero. It's keeping us from investing the necessary time and energy we need to spend on the other parts of the safe system, like safe vehicles, and holding manufacturers accountable. And the result is that we're falling short on the promise we made to every road user when we created the world's first NCAP program in 1979. And that promise can be summed up in a single phrase: more stars mean safer cars. Now, this simple but powerful concept gave auto manufacturers something to strive for. It created consumer demand for safer vehicles. And it proved once and for all that safety sells. This silenced all the critics and inspired NCAPs all over the world, and we're proud of that contribution. And the result is undeniable. New cars are safer. All of us have saved lives by carrying out that mandate. But the promise that more stars means safer cars, it's not quite true here in the United States anymore. Let me tell you why. Nearly all new cars rated by US NCAP receive a 4 or 5 star safety rating. And that happened because we didn't set the bar higher. We have a name for this: starflation, timely given inflation. And it means the star rating doesn't actually guide people in making safer purchase decisions. But I think there's an even bigger safety opportunity, a missed opportunity. US NCAP only rates how well a car does when a crash happens, but it currently does nothing to test how well it prevents a crash in the first place. And that means we're only looking at half the story. In the year 2022, it is unacceptable that a car in the United States can achieve a 5-star safety rating, even if it has 0 collision prevention and other driver assistance technologies. That's not the 0 we're looking for. Now, what we do instead is at best confusing to the public, and at worst, it's a little misleading. I'll read you this line from the NCAP website. It says, and that's the US NCAP, look for vehicles with these driver assistance technologies. And then it goes on to list things like forward collision warning, lane departure warning, automatic emergency braking, and backup cameras. The website calls them recommended features that have met certain, and I quote, performance tests. But the truth is that US NCAP only tests to confirm whether these features are present. It's pass-fail. It's not a grade and it's not a rating. And it's certainly not clear that these technologies are absent from the star rating. In a perfect world, this is what we would do. We would set minimum performance standards. We would test the technology features. We would rate them. And we would put that information somewhere all auto buyers will find it, which is on the window sticker. just like the crash worthiness ratings are, and just like most of the rest of the world does. But the United States government does not do this. And thankfully, organizations like IIHS have stepped up to fill the void. Your tests, like those conducted in other nations, reveal that not all safety technologies are created equal by manufacturer. And this is a fact that many US consumers are unaware of. People buy 15 million new cars and light-duty trucks in the United States every year. And they're making a major purchase decision with incomplete information from their government. A purchase decision that we all know has massive safety improvements, not just for the driver, not just for the passenger, but for all road users. And that is 15 million missed opportunities to save lives. Unfortunately, this problem is not new. Since 1995, the NTSB has issued 25 safety recommendations to the United States Department of Transportation modal agencies and manufacturers on the need to develop performance standards for collision avoidance technologies. Think about that. Our oldest recommendation on vehicle safety technology predates most of the world's NCAP programs. We've also been recommending for years that manufacturers should be required to make safety technology standard, not an upgrade. This is a matter of transportation equity, as we've heard previously today. We can't tolerate a system where only the wealthiest can afford the safest cars. That's not how we get to zero, and it's not right. It's time our regulations reflect the belief that safety is a right and should never be treated as a luxury. Now, it is true, as we've also seen, that some manufacturers are voluntarily stepping up and doing this on their own. They're doing it because Europe, Australia, and New Zealand are requiring it, and IIHS is incentivizing it. And frankly, it's cheaper for them to make one model and sell it everywhere. So people all over the world are reaping the benefits of all of your safety leadership, including us, and I want to say on behalf of the chair, thank you. I am hopeful that the latest attempt to update NCAP will succeed. Yes, we've been here before, but now we have Dr. Cliff, NTSB's safety partner leading NHTSA. He is actually the first Senate-confirmed administrator in half a decade, and there's no one better than him to guide this work. But even if we implement everything in the current plan, we'll still lag many of you. And that's why we need to do more, and we need to do it faster. And we heard this statistic already, and the reason why? The average car on US roads is 12 years old. That means most people buy a new car once a decade if they're lucky. This is a very slow change. And that is why we need to ensure the safest cars are on our roads today, now. Think of it this way. The most vulnerable road users are only as safe as the oldest car on our roads. And that's why we have to factor safety technologies into our NCAP ratings now. We have to set performance standards for features that are on the market today. And they're not emerging technologies just because we don't yet rate them. There are many features that other NCAPs are already testing that the European Union is mandating and which the NTSB has recommended mandating for years, such as forward collision warning, which, as we've heard, Euro NCAP began rating in 2009, and IIHS has been rating since 2013. Automatic emergency braking, again, IIHS in Europe were early adopters. Pedestrian and bicyclist AEB, both were in Euro NCAP by 2018. Alcohol detection technologies, NTSB has been recommending that since 2012. Advanced speed limiting technologies, NTSB has been recommending that since 2013. Yes, it's a long list. And it's going to be a tall order to get all this done. And it's going to require something that many of you have in other nations, frankly, and that's a whole of society commitment to solve the road safety crisis, which, as we know, is a public health crisis. We need the political will to stop the relentless tide of death on our roads and on roads everywhere. We need the willingness to see the whole safety picture, the whole system, and that includes safer vehicles. We have to lay it all on the line and stop at absolutely nothing to get to zero, and not in 5 years, not in 10, today, now. Only then will the United States be the vehicle safety leader we once were and the safety partner each of you deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for standing in at the last moment and delivering with, I'm sure, no less passion or commitment than Jennifer would have delivered. So thank you very much. We can have questions. If people have questions, and Kelly, you're welcome to join us for questions if you like. If anyone does have a burning question already, fantastic.
I have 3 questions, if that's okay.
Sure, I was going to say, let's start with your name and where you're from.
My name is Gabriel Cardos, and I'm the Global Director of Road Safety for a large multinational company. I'm also the Chairman of the Board of the Network of Employers for Traffic Safety, NETS, which is an NGO made up of many sectors representing over 500,000 vehicles globally. My first question to the group here is really, are there plans to have NCAPs in place in, for example, the Middle East and Africa, where many of our businesses are doing business and we have fleets and salespeople driving vehicles in those markets? My second question is more around, as companies are greening their fleets faster, how can the various NCAPs keep up the pace with the testing of the hybrid and electric vehicles? And the third question is, will future NCAPs be testing buses, shuttle buses? There are people in this room that have lost a loved one, whether as a tourist, as a child, as an employee. I know at our company in Mexico, for example, in Juarez, we have shuttle buses and buses taking our employees back and forth to the plants, and we've had some serious incidents. So these are the 3 questions I would like to ask all of you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to redistribute these questions to lucky members of our panel, so thank you very much for those questions. Africa and the Middle East. Yes, I think that's you, David. What's the latest?
Well, we have started a bit like our India program. We started a sort of pilot there called Safe Cars for India that's turned into an NCAP. Of course, India is one country. For Africa, in 2017 we started something called Safe Cars for Africa, and we've been testing new vehicles in South Africa because it is a production hub. And we're very, very interested in extending all of this. A lot depends on resources, and I need to flag up a big thank you to the Bloomberg Philanthropy and also the FI Foundation, without which we couldn't do this work. It's interesting, the story we found in Africa is similar to India, some very poor ratings. We found that although South Africa is a party to the UN agreements, it hasn't been applying them appropriately. So manufacturers have been able to sort of get away with what we would call unacceptably low cars, poor quality cars. It has been getting better. We want to extend the testing across the continent. The other big challenge in Africa is that the majority of the new vehicles are second-hand vehicles imported, and that's a whole separate issue. It's quite a complicated one. It also has exactly the same parallel concern over environmental standards as well. Sometimes the vehicles imported have been tampered with, airbags, catalytic converters and things removed. So there's a whole issue of control of that. Although it's not simply the story that the second-hand vehicles are all bad. In fact, we can, provided the second-hand vehicles aren't that old, some of the second-hand vehicles, provided they haven't been tampered with, are better than new vehicles because they meet European or Japanese standards. But there's a big challenge, exciting one to get in, which we hope will really develop over the next decade to improve the regulatory system for Africa. Middle East is a big gap. And I'm hoping to have, we've had some discussions with authorities in the Emirates, a little bit with Saudi Arabia. The Gulf Cooperation Council has a framework of vehicle standards, but it's, again, not terribly well implemented across the region. And it's the remaining gap in the global geography that we need to get involved with.
Thank you, David. Matthew, are you well positioned to talk about hybrid and EV testing?
Yeah, sure. Certainly in terms of Euro NCAP, we've tested almost all hybrid and battery electric vehicles in the European market. And battery electric vehicles now are taking over. We're seeing far fewer hybrid vehicles because there's very tight emission targets in most countries, and the UK leads quite a lot of that. And manufacturers now, you can see, are turning just to battery electric vehicles, and they're leaving ICE, whether hybrid or non-hybrid, behind. In fact, in the UK, battery electric vehicles outsell diesel passenger cars, which was very, very popular in Europe for a long time for low CO2 reasons. We don't treat them any differently, although, of course, we're careful when we're testing them for their, obviously, battery issues. But we certainly don't see a problem with them. In fact, manufacturers go above and beyond to protect that battery system. There are a lot of concerns over fires, which we don't see as being a problem in the real world, post-crash battery electric fires. So manufacturers are doing a lot to protect the batteries of these. And obviously, it's very important. We think that we've got to play our part in converting consumers to trust battery electric vehicles and telling them that these are safe. People think that, you know, having, 20 gallons of combustible fuel in the vehicle is a safe thing to do, but a battery is dangerous. So we try and, teach them that that's not necessarily the case. So we think we are doing a lot, but as I mentioned in my talk, there are things that we need to do to help the emergency services, so post-crash, to be able to get access to the vehicle, know where to cut these vehicles, know where to isolate the electric cables to make sure that they're safe. So you've got trust with everybody in the whole crash spectrum. So I think we're doing a lot to address that.
And buses and other shuttles. Does anyone have, yeah?
Yeah, I can comment on that. I would say ditto on what Matthew just said about EVs. Everything we've tested looks just as good as internal combustion engines. And we monitor the insurance data here in the US when it comes to looking at fires. So that's the other thing we're looking closely at. And he's right, ICEs are still more dangerous than electric vehicles when it comes to non-crash fire risk. When it comes to looking at other types of vehicles, one of the challenges is resources, and how much do we have available to us to be able to test the complete fleet of vehicles. Mike, not working? Sorry. So one of the things that we look at is we're constantly looking at the data to see where we need to spend our resources when it comes to testing. And we've had discussions internally, and you saw some of the other NCAPs that are testing commercial vehicles. We're not doing that at IIHS yet, just because we don't have the resources. Our long-term goal is for a lot of the tests that we are conducting to eventually reach a point where what we are testing for is eventually regulated, and then we can stop testing. And when we can stop testing, then we can turn our resources to addressing other kinds of vehicles and other safety problems that we're not currently addressing. But we're just not there yet.
Is this working?
I
just one additional point on buses. In London, the Transport for London, the authority, has mandating intelligent speed assistance across its entire fleet. And they've got a rollout over the next decade to have 100% coverage. They've already retrofitted. There are retrofit systems for intelligent speed assistance. They're produced by a range of companies. Mobileye do it, Sturdy do it, which is a US company. And the preliminary data from London is extremely impressive. Off the top of my head, they've had something like a 300% reduction in speeding violations across their vehicles. And that's really impressive. And so I think from a fleet perspective, where you're trying to keep your vehicles on the road, legal, not having violations, not having any injuries, also in terms of workplace health and safety and all the rest of it, there is an overwhelming case for supporting intelligent speed assistance as a technology, and you don't have to wait for it to be in new vehicles because you can retrofit. And it pays dividends because of all the crash reduction risk, but it saves fuel as well. So what is not to like about ISA for fleets? If I was a fleet manager, I would be immediately contacting the suppliers of ISA technology right now.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the floor? Or do we have questions coming through online? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Tom Leggett from Thatcher Research, so I work with Matthew. But I had a question for Stefan about Latin NCAP. Obviously, the graph you showed there of all the vehicle manufacturers, very, very poor ratings. You know, they're big names, right? They're not obscure manufacturers we've never heard of before. Do you have any tactics to try and convince and kind of coerce these manufacturers to really kind of demonstrate this technology in your market as well? Because we know that they can do it, but there's a kind of finessing technique you need to do to kind of get them to do it in your market as well. So I don't know if you've got any plans or thoughts on how you can do that best.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, the program itself is pushing car makers in order to improve those models they commercialize, which are being which obtain a very poor safety rating. As out of the 14 models that we tested on 2021, 2020, with which most of them were 0 stars, 7 of them, which is part of the latest protocol. That's why they're so. They are, because it's more stringent as ever as we have done, they have poorly rated, and half of them are already undergoing improvements for the mid and long term. So the program itself is like the catalyzer for improving car safety, because once those results are known to the public and to decision makers and road users and consumers, then they have to do something in order to keep their prestige. So we're expecting, as we have seen, remember that 76% of the models tested by Latin NCAP, that Latin NCAP had exclusive liberty to choose which to test. 70% of those cars tested by Latin NCAP already underwent improvement in their safety performance. So the program itself is what we're hoping will make the car makers improve their models.
Sure.
The point is not about Mexico per se, although, as Stefan mentioned, there are a lot of issues there around the role of industry. I want to make a very clear distinction between individual manufacturers and industry associations. Industry associations have a very perverse effect, because the policy they adopt, which they represent in the UN or at national level in governments, is always lowest common denominator. Industry associations only move at the speed of their least effective member, least competitive member. And the companies that are great don't really do anything about that. They're, in a funny way, they're quite content for the industry collective position to be behind where they are. So they just sit on their hands. But when governments meet with the industry, they meet with these industry association people who always aim to deny, deflect, and delay. That is their standard practice. In Mexico, in 2014, I think, was when the NOM regulation first was promoted by the government. The standard operating starting position of IAMA, is that right? AMIA was, you don't need crash test standards, leave them out. I mean, unbelievable position. Of course, I don't think they really believed it. That was a delaying tactic. And they succeeded. So it was 2016 that they finally...
they published?
They finally, yeah. And so they succeeded in a delay of, and now those crash tests are in. And then we have this sort of spectacularly outrageous situation that electronic stability control regulated here in, applied here from around 2011. Jeff Runge, the previous administrator, went to the United Nations, a Republican, by the way, went to the United Nations to persuade the UN to regulate for a global standard for ESC, a great achievement for NHTSA. What have we got next door? 2027, because of the industry lobby. Now, I don't blame individual manufacturers. I blame them collectively for being members of that association. It should be dissolved. Just for a point of clarity, that rogue industry association is not a member of OICA. Maybe that's why it behaves so badly. So really, there is an issue with industry associations. I mentioned the motorcycle association. It's called IMMA, the Immoral Motorcycle. Sorry, no, it's the International Motorcycle Manufacturers Association. They lobby relentlessly against ABS in motorcycles. I know the guy who runs it. I mean, he's quite funny to talk to over a beer. I mean, he's just doing his job. But, you know, there's some problem, an institutional problem with industry associations. So my message to governments, just don't listen to them. Or whatever they say about cost, timescale, and the rest of it, ignore it by a factor of at least 75%.
Thank you for those comments. The audience, who's not suffering jet lag and has questions? Jess.
Hi, it's Jessica Chung from the Towards Zero Foundation. I've got a question for David Harkey. It's more around seatbelts. So you mentioned a lot about seatbelt reminders. I just want to understand what your thoughts are around the value of seatbelt interlocks that actually don't give drivers the option of not being belted before they actually start the ignition of the car. Do you see any value in seatbelt interlocks?
So the research that we did a few years ago on trying to figure out what would motivate people to buckle up. We looked at different kinds of interlocks in addition to the extended chime. And what we discovered is whether it was an interlock to prevent you from shifting into gear or an interlock that limited your speed, it was no more effective at getting people to buckle up than the extended chime was. And that's the reason we went with the extended chime as the appropriate intervention here in the US. And I think that's what we were trying to get to. Can we come up with an intervention that perhaps will motivate people to wear their belt and yet be as simple as possible for the automakers to implement? And a lot of the seatbelt, we've had these discussions with automakers. They knew this was coming. We've talked to them. And many of them say it's a simple software change for them. And so they're already doing it. They're starting down that path, and so we expect this change to happen, you know, immediately for a lot of them. What's more difficult for them in some cases is the second row sensing of the belts. Now, some of the automakers already have those sensors in place and they can do this and it's not a big deal, but others, that will take a little more time for everyone to get to a point to where they can get that good rating in our new seatbelt reminder system because of that particular physical requirement to implement the technology.
Matthew.
Yeah, it's strange to me, David, that I look at, you know, European seatbelt reminder systems and, you know, how far ahead we are compared with yourselves. It's amazing because we are, again, talking about the same manufacturers here. You know, we've had seatbelt reminder systems since the early 2000s as an integral part of the Euro NCAP ratings, and all manufacturers fit it on first and second rows, sometimes third row as well, and they get penalised if they don't fit it. So they are fitting seatbelt reminder systems. You know, when we've done studies of seatbelt usage with vehicles fitted with seatbelt reminder systems, it's phenomenal. It's 99% plus. Yeah. And we get so many complaints about people saying, I hate these seatbelt reminder gongs that go off. You know, the only way I can shut them up is by putting the belt on. That's exactly what we want. So, and it's a bone of contention with the vehicle manufacturers because It's one of the vagaries of our protocols that we insist on the gongs being loud and clear. And a lot of manufacturers want that absolute definition. And we say, we can't give you that absolute definition. We all know what loud and clear is. But we still see an issue, certainly in South European countries, where some people will buckle the belt to shut it up, but they'll sit on the belt. And that's where the next generation of our technology comes in with driver monitoring systems, because the driver monitoring system can actually see where the belt run is. And if you are sitting on the belt, can just repeat those gongs to make sure that you've got the belt around you. So that's why we're saying that driver monitoring systems are going to be so crucial in the future, looking at cognitive awareness, looking at belt usage, looking at people trapped in the vehicle. Driver monitoring systems are absolutely fundamental, and they can address the misuse that we still have with drivers who are misusing belt reminder systems.
Other comments?
Can I raise it's come up a little bit, sort of, it's a very key issue, but not top of the agenda normally for safety people, which is the trade issues behind all of this. And what I'm reminded is, at a Republican fundraiser some years ago, President Donald Trump made a slightly bizarre joke, complaining about what he called the bowling ball test. And he was complaining about Japan applying this unfair trade restriction, which he called the bowling ball test. What it was the pedestrian protection test with the bonnet hood, and it was the head form. And he called it the bowling ball. And he typically got it wrong. He said the US cars dented, and therefore they failed. Actually, it was the other way around. They were too stiff. But whoever had briefed him from, I guess, some manufacturer, hadn't explained it properly, or he hadn't got it. Anyway, this got a little flurry in the media. And it was an odd occasion because I decided to write to him. So I wrote a letter on behalf of Global NCAP pointing out that there was a simple solution to this, is sign up to the pedestrian protection protocol, and then you'd have all the trade access you need. And explaining that its history, that it was a voluntary agreement first in Europe, and then it became a global standard. And by the way, in the working group on the global standard, who led a lot of it? None other than NHTSA. They had been heavily involved in it. So they knew all about this. And by the way, it was going to be included in the US NCAP upgrade proposed under the Obama administration in 2015. So anyway, I never got a reply. I didn't expect one. But what is rather disturbing is that still, and you alluded to this, there are trade issues, and it's an unfortunate consequence of different pressures and different bits of the US administration at work, where countries like Mexico and others in Latin America are discouraged from applying best practice UN regulations, such as the GTR, the Global Technical Regulation for Pedestrian Protection, because it is said that this will interfere with US-Mexico trade. Or there was a case a few years back, Ecuador was going to do this. In fact, the US took them to the World Trade Organization in a sort of low-key dispute. Now, this is very, very unfortunate because it's a negative signal to these countries to move to where they should in terms of best practice. Now, I know that in the discussion, as Dr. Cliff explained, there are various criteria about why the US adopts different standards. It's got to tick all these boxes. But there is, on some basic, what we would regard as minimum standards that are well established, where all the technology is well established, where other major markets are doing it, there is a very strong case for global harmonization. Because that's a signal to the whole world, it's a signal to the whole industry, and it takes a burden away from countries like Mexico being told, as I understand it, a US trade representative in one of the discussions in Mexico saying it's better if you don't do the pedestrian protection standard. So, and I'll give you another example. When this Ecuador story came up, I heard about it. I rang my friends in NHTSA and said, the Department of Commerce is having a go at Ecuador. They were completely astounded and knew nothing about it. And it was the US car lobby with the Department of Commerce having a go. And the federal authority that really knows about all of this, completely not aware. And so I think the trade issues are quite important. And if we take seriously the goal of the next decade, we really should harmonize around these minimum global standards. It will be better for manufacturers in the long run, cheaper for consumers, better for safety. And so I think there's a case for the US signing up to a pedestrian protocol, even if it doesn't think it's going to be, I mean, I think they're right, A/B pedestrian is probably a more significant thing. Although don't forget that actually all these regulations benefit each other. If you've got softer hoods and all the rest of it, then it actually will be working more effectively with pedestrian A/B. So I would make a strong plea for the US to lead in one or two areas like this, including, of course, anti-lock brakes and motorcycles.
Thank you. Further questions?
Sorry, I can't help myself. 2 more questions, please. The very first quick one, David, you mentioned harmonization. My question is, do you see further collaboration and harmonization between all of your groups in terms of the criteria you're using? We hear that Euro NCAP in some cases way ahead of the other NCAPs, and even, we're using star ratings where you're using, a different number system. It would be nice to get all of that harmonized. The second question, if I were a private sector company coming to either of your organizations, giving you a list of the vehicles that we're procuring in each region, asking you, can you please provide my organization with 5-star ratings based on your testing of all of those? Do you have databases to help support companies in that respect?
Thank you. I was going to take the second question first.
I'm doing the first, if you like.
Sure.
Which is that on the NCAPs are not regulatory systems. They're not setting minimum standards. They're stretching performance. So they don't need to harmonize fully. In fact, there's even, I think, a danger if they did, because they're always trying to, in their different markets, stretch performance. What I do think is happening with the NCAPs around the world is there's a sort of convergence. They're moving at different speeds in certain similar directions, but full harmonization is probably not desirable. And that's because they're fundamentally playing a different role than regulations. I think the case for harmonizing regulations globally at minimum levels are good. And I really emphasize minimum regulations. The whole point about NCAPs is to stretch performance beyond. And I think the point that David made, a really interesting one, is NCAPs can innovate, develop things, introduce them, then regulators pick it up, and then NCAPs are free to spend the money on something else. And that's really what we want.
That's essentially what we have in Europe with GSR2, because GSR2 has adopted most of the things that Euro NCAP has been working on over the last 20 years, which is allowing us the headroom to look at commercial vehicles, mobility service, et cetera, because so many of the things now, like A, B for pedestrian, et cetera, are all going to be regulated.
I think just to add to the harmonisation point, in terms of the way that works in the Australasian context with Euro NCAP, it would be, our rules would be around 95% the same, but there are a couple of areas. A good example is eCall. In Australia, we just don't have the infrastructure to support eCall at the moment. Where eCall is being used, it's a third-party, I guess, service add-on that a manufacturer might provide. It's only for the first 3 years of the vehicle's life, usually, for free, and then after that you have to pay, which is not quite consistent with what Euro NCAP's protocols require. And then in our context in Australia, we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have necessarily the mobile network coverage to be able to support that. So we take a different approach on the scoring. The requirement's still there, but the way we score it is how we differentiate. Our child seats are different to Europe, so there are some tweaks that we have to make. But I think because in Australia we receive, anywhere between around 40% of the vehicles are coming from Europe, that's been a particularly smooth path compared to maybe some of the other jurisdictions. And we don't have any local manufacturing in Australia anymore either, so we are importing everything. Where we see that harmonisation work really well, I think is in those markets where the vehicles are more advanced But obviously it's chicken and egg, so without lifting the bar, you're not going to get better safety specifications. On the fleet point, that's one that I might kick off, and if any of the panellists have anything to add on that. In Australia, we have around 50% of vehicle sales each year are to fleets. So we work very closely with fleets, both through the Industry Association and through the government and corporate fleets directly. We do provide quite detailed information to them. So in our jurisdictions, we will provide a lot of data around what vehicles ratings are, and we have a recommendation for fleets to purchase vehicles with a date stamp of 3 years or less, and obviously 5 stars. So we have a very strong 5-star fleet requirement in Australia. And that really has been a significant, that's really lifted that proportion of new vehicle sales, and the statistic that Matthew showed around coverage for us, we last year provided ratings for around 95% of vehicles, and around 89% hit the 5-star mark. And that is in large part because when you have 50% of vehicles being purchased by fleets and they require 5 stars, you get a big lift there. So that's been a really significant.
Sorry, is it also in large part that a lot of the vehicles are coming from Europe because they're already probably tested at a high standard, or not?
So the vehicles that come from Europe, and this is probably an interesting point for people to understand how the harmonisation works on a day-to-day basis. We test to the same protocols, and that also means that if a vehicle's been tested in Europe, we can take the results. So we don't have to retest that vehicle, but we do have to check that the vehicle's the same. And reflecting on my comments earlier, just because a vehicle's sold by the same name doesn't necessarily mean that it has the same specifications. So we do have to get information from the manufacturer to make sure that if there are differences, they're still within the allowable tolerances. Obviously, you've got left-hand, right-hand drive differences in some cases. And so we need data to support the ability to utilise data from the manufacturer to support our ability to use the rating or the rating data from Europe, and then we put that through our own process. For Australia, we're receiving a high number of vehicles through the process where they've been tested in Europe, and we're able to apply a rating based on that test data into Australia. It can be anywhere between sort of 40 to 50%, depending on sales volume. For the remainder of vehicles, they're coming usually from Asia or the US into the Australian market, and they are the ones that we tend to test locally. So we're testing to the same protocols, and in the event that those vehicles are then sold into the European market, there are examples where Euro NCAP can utilise those test results, and the rating goes back the other way. So for us, that in terms of what we're testing on a day-to-day basis, our focus is usually on the US and Asian manufacturers, and that having that same standard is really key for us. If we weren't operating to the same standard, it would be very, very difficult and very confusing for manufacturers and very confusing for consumers as well. So it's working really well in our market, but our market is not the same as others. So I think that's an important point.
One other thing on the fleets, I mentioned that we're testing commercial vans and now moving into heavy trucks. That, is not a communication with the consumer now. That's a communication with a fleet, with a company. And there's a very different motivation for buying a vehicle there, and often it's driven by an economic reason, not because, you like the brand or you like the colour. And therefore, we've got very much a B2B communication issue, and we're working with those fleets and working with those fleet managers to make sure that they understand the motivation for buying a safer fleet. And it's not only for protecting their drivers in their vehicles, which is very important, but it's also about protecting their brand. You know, manufacturers and companies, they don't want to see, you know, UPS, you know, all over social media because that vehicle's been involved in a collision. It doesn't do their brand any good. And so some of the motivation and some of the communication and the narrative that we've got with these companies is about protecting, you know, your vehicle, protecting your fleet, protecting, you know, the economics of your fleet, but there's also brand reputation as well. So there's lots of different things that we try and, you know, tug the heartstrings of the fleet manager, because the first response is, well, I can't afford this stuff. We say, well, you can't afford not to have it. And if all your competitors have got it and you haven't, woe betide you, you know, when you end up in court. And there's a question as to why didn't you select this? Because the information was there for you to have, and your competitors have all done this, and you didn't. Did you make that decision purely on an economic, you know, reason? So that's what we've got to do, and certainly as we move into commercial vehicles and mobility as a service, it's a very different game, and we recognise that.
Just to add to that, I think a very powerful point about that duty of care that they have. But what's really interesting, I think this is true in quite a lot of countries, but in the UK, there's been something like a 25, over the last few years, 25%, nearly 30% increase in registration of commercial vans, a big growth, partly driven by the change in the whole retail environment and so on. And there was a study done by the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, UK group, showing that vans are disproportionately involved in fatal crashes. And that's partly exposure. They're on the roads much more. So it really is, and then the Euro NCAP ratings recently showed that vans are really alarmingly less specified in terms of safety. So there's a big challenge there to improve, and I think there's a positive synergy with the fleet purchases, where you can show that this, you can appeal to them about, you know, the if you like, the moral imperative of safety, but you can also appeal to their bottom line, because better specified vehicles are less likely to be involved in crashes. And generally be more efficient in the use they're using.
So I was going to make one more point on the harmonization question, because I think we get this question all the time. And the question you ask is the question we often get from the automakers. Why can't you guys all run the same test? Right? And I think, yeah, you know, they want harmonization on that side, yet they don't want harmonization when it comes to what David's talking about and putting standards in around the world, you know, with regards to vehicles. But one of the things that I think is important, if you think about the global NCAPs around the world when it comes to harmonization, or the lack thereof in the way that we currently operate, is we do innovate and we do push the boundaries. And I think one of the advantages of that is we learn from one another, and we build on that knowledge that each of us are kind of developing independently. And we don't operate in a vacuum. I mean, we talk to one another, we know the roadmaps, we know where everyone's going. But that's a huge advantage. And I think the other advantage is that for those of us who have a few more resources and are able to push harder, you know, I feel like IIHS is in that position, Euro NCAP is in that position. I feel like the other global NCAP groups around the world can learn from the more developed NCAPs and those that have more resources, and then it saves them from having to repeat a lot of the same work, and they can focus on their problems. One of the things that David mentioned was the problem of motorcycles, and that's a huge problem, right, in certain parts of Asia, and that's where their focus needs to be, and it's where their focus is. So they don't have to put as much focus on the passenger vehicle side of things or fleet side of things that other NCAPs are picking up. So I think this distribution across the global NCAP network is really, really important when it comes to driving systematic change throughout the world.
Just to add to that, because 100% right, and it's impressive to see one of our close partners, who unfortunately couldn't be here, is ASEAN NCAP, which runs from Malaysia, from Myros. They're innovating themselves. They've introduced a blind spot detection with an improved rear view mirror system for motorcycles, which is a world first in NCAP. So in fact, we can We can learn from them in the application of that. And they've also developed they were developing a world-first motorcycle rating system, which, by the way, you can't get top marks unless you have my favorite subject of the hour, anti-lock brakes and motorcycles. And I know that Euro NCAP is starting to look at issues in terms of testing with motorcycles. So we can learn, the whole global community of NCAPs can learn from each other all the time. And that's why it's such a privilege to work in global NCAP. I was on the very first board of Euro NCAP, and I still have to rub my eyes when I think of what we were discussing. And by the way, sorry to harp on about this, incredible hostility we had to put up with from ASEA, the European Car Manufacturers Association, when we launched Euro NCAP. They ran a rival press conference on the first set of results we had in 1997, completely rubbishing everything we did. And actually, it was great because it created a big row, and we got twice as much coverage. They're much smarter now. They don't do that because they realize that it generates news. But when I think, looking at what Matthew was showing, I just think, wow, 25 years ago, it was controversial for us to have got the offset deformable barrier at 64 kilometers an hour, and having pedestrian protection was regarded as completely outrageous. And look where they've gone now. I mean, I just find it breathtaking.
And the important thing, I think, also is to remember, we've taken the vehicle manufacturers with us.
Yeah.
They've learned, as you said, they're not so aggressive towards us now, and they're working with us. So in terms of the 25-30 roadmap I was talking about, we've consulted with them, and they've agreed, and they've fed back and said, yes, we can do this, that's a good idea, don't know about that, and that might be too much of a jump. So the consultation and bringing them with you is very much, I think, because they recognise they need to innovate and sell products. A lot of the people we're talking about, the safety advocates, actually believe in what we do, and they've got to be empowered within their organisations, because you've got the head of that organisation who's trying to fight for money from powertrain or battery electric vehicles or styling or whatever, and it empowers the safety engineer to want this, to need to have this technology. So it is a very symbiotic relationship we have with the vehicle manufacturers.
I really want to say I sound like I'm very anti-manufacturer. I've got a thing about industry associations, not individual companies. And it's interesting, in India, with our program there, when we launched this thing, SIAM, the industry association, was completely condemnatory about us. But we had an interesting dialogue with individual manufacturers, and now Tata Mahindra, as I mentioned, they've been really good at getting the point about the benefits and totally transformed their approach to vehicle design and production. And it's wonderful to see. And let me tell you one little story, and then I really should shut up. When Euro NCAP got going, the president of ASEA, European Car Manufacturers Association, was Louis Schweitzer, who was head of Renault, a distinguished member of the Schweitzer family and a very interesting guy. And the chair of Euro NCAP and myself, we were summoned to see him at the headquarters of Renault. This was in 1998. And it felt like we were being summoned, like naughty boys being summoned to see the headmaster. And we went into the Boulogne-Billancourt headquarters, and there we were sitting with Mr. Schweitzer. And he read out, he had this brown folder, he opened it, read out a statement, which was the headmaster reading the Riot Act about what do you think, ASEA thinks this, and blah, 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 all criticism. Then he put it to one side, and then we had a really animated discussion about what we were all trying to do. And at the end, he said, well, that was very interesting. I want to invite you to our technical center outside Paris. And so about a month later, we were meeting the top research people there. And it was brilliant, one of the nicest visits I've had to a car company. And at the end, the then head of vehicle research came up and gave me a sort of warm Gallic embrace and said, what you're doing is so important. He said, we've had complete change of instructions from the top. And I thought, oh, interesting. And then jump forward to around 2006, I think it was, Mr. Schweitzer was again president of ASEA on a sort of rotation. And he invited Max Mose and myself to dinner in Paris in a very nice restaurant called Taïwan, Michelin star restaurant, private room. We went in, and he said, very nice to see you again. And we all sat down and started the dinner. And he said, I just want to say, I had to read you a statement when I was last SAR president in 1998. He said, I didn't agree with a single word of it.
Yeah. Are the first 5-star car a Renault?
Exactly. Exactement, mon ami.
I think we've got time for one final question before we have to wrap up, if there is one. If there is not, I will ask each participant to maybe give their 30-second final closing remarks, key points, takeaway comments. Got enough time for 30 seconds to 1 minute each. I will keep strict time on certain members of the panel. So David Harkey, would you like to kick us off? Any last final comments?
I think I thank David for putting this together and bringing us all here. As I said, this group I think is really important at driving change when it comes to vehicle safety. But I think what you may have taken away from some of the presentations today is that we're going to continue to do everything that we can in terms of improving vehicle safety, but that alone is not going to solve our problems. And so, particularly here in the U.S. And so we have a lot of things that we need to address when it comes to our infrastructure, when it comes to behaviors on the roadway. I don't need to go through all of it again. I think what's clear, though, is we need to think differently. And we need to start thinking, just like we learn from other global NCAPs that we are involved in about vehicle safety measures, we need to be smart enough in the U.S. to learn what's worked when it comes to this safe systems approach. Yeah, it's great that we've adopted that. We've got that as part of the national strategy now. But the key is going to be implementation of that moving forward. So it's nice to have the nice little chart there, and it's nice to have adopted that. But if we do not implement that correctly, or we do not take that seriously, and we do not learn from other countries around the world that have adopted that approach, we will fail. And I think that's the big message that I want to send to everyone is let's take that safe systems approach seriously, and let's figure out how to move forward here in the U.S.
Thanks, David. Matthew, put you on the spot next.
I would say we have come a long way in a relatively short time. And, you were talking about 30 years of NCAP. I was talking about 25 years of Euro NCAP. Obviously, NCAP itself, US NCAP, has been around a much longer. And we have come a long way, but we've got a long way to go as well. And if I think about, the future, I think about future mobility as a service, and how vehicles are going to change. We have to still do a lot more to protect, people around the world. And we're doing a good job already, I think. But if we really want to achieve that goal of, 50 by 30, we have to try a lot harder. And it's working together and bringing the community together and the system approach. And remember, safety is a team sport. So we've got to work together to deliver this.
Thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, well, I would say that I would like to take on what Kelly was mentioning about the role that the U.S. had been playing before as a leader on the car safety agenda. And I totally subscribe that it has to be resumed by the actual authorities, because if they don't, then it's going to be harder, even more for us in the emerging countries, in the emerging markets, to push forward the regulations that we need in order to protect, especially vulnerable road users. As I've mentioned before, it accounts for more than half of the death toll and the road death toll in my country. So I'm very happy that it's going to be this upgrade of the NCAP program. And also it's going to be very important to keep on, as Latin NCAP, pushing for car safety labeling in the countries of our region, because given the gap between the regulations we have between the mature economies and our economies emerging countries, the best we can have now in order to improve at a safer, at a more, with more speed to accelerate the implementation of those regulations is through letting the public know what's the safety of the cars that are being offered in our markets through an NCAP star rating system. So that's my take for it.
Thank you. David, you've got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I just want to go back to the my chart about the 1 billion, the extra fleet of 1 billion vehicles that we're likely to have, cohort coming. I mean, we really must make sure, as I said, that's the safest, cleanest vehicle cohort that we're ever going to have. And to achieve that, we need all the work by everybody here. But I completely agree. I thought Jenny's speech was wonderful, and I think US leadership is really needed. We can't do this all alone. We are a sort of family, and it's great to see US leadership back, but now please deliver.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I do want to make a couple of additional thank yous before we finally close out the session. So obviously, thank you to David for putting this together. But also thank you to the Euro NCAP team, so Carolina and the rest of the team who are here today. And I know Jess has probably had a hand in this as well. So thank you to all of you. And also I did want to make mention of Alejandro, who can't be here today, but we know he was heavily involved. Please join me in thanking Kelly for standing in at the last minute with comments. And our panellists, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for coming today, and I hope you have a safe return journey to wherever you're off to next, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.